For those who have ever stood at the edge of something beautiful and dangerous and chosen to step closer anyway. The Amalfi Coast did not apologize for itself. It rose from the Tyrrhenian Sea in great limestone cliffs, white and bone-pale, draped in cascading bougainvillea, so violent in their pinks and reds that they looked like wounds in the rock. The villages clung to the cliffs the way desperate things cling, Positano, Ravello, Priano. Their pastel buildings stacked one upon another as if someone had simply dropped a handful of painted sugar cubes from the sky and let them fall where they may. The water below was the color of crushed sapphires, layered in gradients from deep navy at the horizon to impossible turquoise where it kissed the pale stone shores. Fiora Esposito had seen photographs. She had scrolled through them on her phone in the back of a taxi in Chicago, in the fluorescent sterility of O'Hare International during the 11-hour flight across the Atlantic. But no photograph, not a single one, had prepared her for the physical reality of standing at the top of the switchback road above Priano with her oversized rolling suitcase jammed sideways in the narrow lane, while a Vespa horn screamed at her from behind. Va bene, she called out, which was approximately 30% of her Italian vocabulary, as she wrenched the suitcase to the side of the road. The Vespa, driven by a teenage boy who looked supremely unimpressed, shot past her in a blur of chrome and attitude. Fiora exhaled. She was 28 years old, a freelance art director from the Wicker Park neighborhood of Chicago, and she had not taken a vacation in 3 years. Not since her business partner and ex-boyfriend Marco had walked out of their studio and their apartment in the same afternoon, leaving her with the lease on both, twice the workload, and a very specific and now very deeply buried fear that she was the kind of person things simply happened to, rather than the kind of person who made things happen. She had booked this trip in a burst of late-night courage, after 2 glasses of Barolo and an impulsive search for most beautiful places on Earth. She had found a listing for a beachfront villa. Villa del Mar, it was called, Villa of the Sea, for a month in July. The photographs showed white linen curtains moving in a sea breeze, a terrace with a mosaic table, a path down to a private rocky beach. It had cost more than she should have spent. She had paid immediately. She was now standing with her suitcase on a road the width of a generous hallway, looking down at a cluster of buildings that may or may not contain her villa, trying to determine whether the stone steps below her were the ones described in the rental instructions or a different set of stone steps that would lead her somewhere deeply wrong. She pulled out her phone. The directions said, "Follow the steps beside the yellow house down to the water. The villa is the last one on the left before the cliff. The key is under the second pot from the door." There was a yellow house. There were steps. She began to drag her suitcase down them, bumping over stone in a rhythm that she chose to find meditative. The path wound through a small garden gone slightly wild, lemon trees heavy with fruit, rosemary sprawling across the stone borders, a cat of indeterminate age watching her from a wall with the specific contempt that Italian cats reserved for tourists. Then the path curved, and the sea opened up before her with such sudden extravagance that she stopped walking entirely. It was late afternoon. The light was doing something criminal to the water, turning it gold and rose at the surface, keeping it deep cerulean underneath, and the cliffs caught the same light and turned amber, and a fishing boat was making its slow way toward the distant harbor, and Fiora Esposito, who had spent the last 3 years in the gray grind of a city that demanded everything and gave back very little, felt something loosen in her chest. She found the villa. It was exactly as advertised. Small, white, stone-walled, with green shutters and a terrace that jutted out over a 10-foot drop to the rocky beach below. The key was under the second pot from the door, exactly as promised. What was not in the listing, and what she only discovered once she had hauled her suitcase inside, poured herself a glass of water from the kitchen tap, and walked out onto the terrace to watch the sun finish its descent, was the villa next door. It was not a villa. It was a compound. Where her rental was charming and modest and roughly the size of a generous Chicago apartment, the property to her left was something else entirely. It occupied the next terrace down, built into the cliff with the kind of architectural confidence that came from having an unlimited budget and no desire to impress anyone in particular. The main structure was white stone, broad and low, its lines modern and severe. A terrace of polished limestone stretched out toward the sea, furnished with heavy teak pieces, not the cheerful tourist furniture of rentals, but the settled permanence of a place that belonged to someone specific. There was a pool at the edge of the terrace, its water so still and blue it looked painted. There was a pergola draped in white wisteria. There was, at the far end, a figure. He had his back to her. He was standing at the railing of the lower terrace, looking out to sea, and he was very still in the way that certain men were still, not relaxed, but contained. He wore dark trousers and a white linen shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and even from this distance and this angle, she could see that he was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, Italian in every particular she could discern. She was not staring. She was simply observing her immediate surroundings, which included, incidentally, a very attractive man on an adjacent terrace. As if he felt her attention, and perhaps he did, because in Fiora's experience, men like that always did, he turned. His face, even at 20 meters, was striking. Strong-jawed, dark-eyed, handsome with an edge of something that made the word handsome feel slightly inadequate. He looked at her with an expression that communicated nothing, revealed nothing, gave nothing. Then he looked back at the sea. Fiora went back inside to unpack. She told herself she was not thinking about him. She was, of course, thinking about him. His name was Nero Falcone. He was 36 years old. He had been born in Naples, in the hospital on Via Posillipo, on a February morning during a thunderstorm, which his grandmother had said was an omen, and which Nero had long since decided to take as a compliment. He had grown up in the Quartieri Spagnoli, the Spanish quarters, in a building that still bore the scorch marks of a fire that had happened before his birth, among people who were defined first and foremost by their loyalty, and secondly by their willingness to enforce it. He was, by any accounting that mattered in Campania, the most powerful man between Naples and Salerno. The Falcone family had run their particular segment of the Campanian underworld for 3 generations. Not the Camorra in any of its fractious, flashy iterations, but something older, more structured, more deliberately invisible. They did not traffic in the things that drew attention. They facilitated. Money moved through legitimate channels they controlled. Contracts were arranged. Problems were solved with a quiet efficiency that left no obvious evidence and required no subsequent headlines. Nero had taken the organization at 27, upon the death of his father, not of violence, which surprised everyone, but of a heart that had simply grown tired of carrying what it carried. He had restructured, professionalized, eliminated the elements that carried too much risk and not enough return. He had made it, in the way that mattered most, sustainable. He had also, in the process, made himself into a man who lived largely alone. The villa at Priano was the one indulgence he permitted himself. He came here every July, the same month, the same 4 weeks, and he left the city behind with a completeness that he could not achieve anywhere else. In Naples, he was always the Falcone boss. Here, he was simply a man who swam in the sea every morning and drank wine in the evenings and read, occasionally, and thought about what he had built and what it had cost him. He had been here for 3 days when the woman arrived next door. He had heard her before he saw her, the clattering of a suitcase on the stone steps, a soft American curse in English, the specific quality of silence that followed someone's first encounter with that particular view of the sea. He had been standing at the railing, not thinking about anything important, when he turned and found her on the upper terrace. She was looking at him with the unguarded directness of someone who did not yet know they were being noticed. Dark hair pulled up in a knot that was losing its battle with the sea breeze. Large eyes, brown, he thought, though he could not be certain from this distance. A yellow dress that moved in the wind. Her face had the quality of someone who felt things fully and had not yet learned to hide it, which was something he found both alien and, unexpectedly, arresting. He looked away. He had no business looking. But he had already noted everything worth noting. She was American. The curse, the suitcase, the particular way she had stood on that terrace like someone receiving a gift they had not expected. She was young, she was alone, and she was going to be his neighbor for however long she had rented that villa. He went inside and called his head of security, a man named Enzo, who was paid very well to be unflappable. "There's a woman in the rental next door," Nero said. Find out who she is." There was a brief pause, the kind Enzo allowed himself when he thought a request was unnecessary, but would never say so. "Of course." Nero stood in his kitchen, which was all white marble and professional-grade appliances and the kind of order that came from living alone, and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, and told himself it was simple due diligence. Every unfamiliar person in proximity to him required assessment. That was a rule, not a preference. It had nothing whatsoever to do with a yellow dress and unguarded eyes. Fiora woke before the alarm she'd set for 7. The room was filled with the particular quality of early Mediterranean morning. A blue-gray light that had not yet committed to becoming gold filtered through the white linen curtains that moved in the sea breath coming through the window she'd left open. She lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere below, water moved against stone in a gentle, rhythmic percussion. Somewhere distant, a boat engine murmured. A bird, something small and Italian, and clearly unaware that it was not yet an acceptable hour, sang 3 insistent notes from the lemon tree outside. She had slept deeply, dreamlessly, which was unusual. In Chicago she woke several times a night, her mind producing invoices and deadlines and the low-grade anxiety that was simply the operating temperature of modern urban professional life. Here, apparently, she had simply closed her eyes and been unconscious until the light changed. She got up and made coffee with the mocha pot she'd found in the kitchen cabinet. Dented, well used, the kind that had lived in this kitchen for 20 years, and carried it out to the terrace in a ceramic cup with a blue fish painted on the side. The sea was silver in the early light. The cliffs were still in shadow, their limestone faces cool and gray, the bougainvillea on them not yet the hot pink it would become when the sun found it. A fishing boat was already out, 2 actually, small white shapes moving with deliberate patience across the calm water. She sat in the small iron chair at the mosaic table and drank her coffee, and thought that this was, without question, the correct decision she had made in years. Possibly the first correct decision. Her phone was inside. She had made a rule for herself. No phone before 9, which was radical and terrifying and necessary. She had 48 open emails she could not currently see, and they could keep. She heard, from next door, the sound of water. He was swimming. She could see him from the terrace, not clearly, not intrusively, but enough. The pool at the edge of his lower terrace caught the early light, and he moved through it in long, clean strokes, back and forth, with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who did this every day. He swam for what seemed like a long time, maybe 30 minutes, without variation or pause, just the steady back and forth, the precise turn at each end, the controlled breathing she could almost hear in the morning quiet. Then he stopped, hauled himself out of the pool in one clean motion, and stood with his hands on his hips for a moment, looking out at the sea. His back was to her. He wore dark swim shorts. He was, as she had suspected from the previous evening, objectively very well made. Broad back, narrow hips, the kind of physical symmetry that read less like vanity than like a life that had made demands and been met. He reached for a towel folded on a nearby chair, dried his face without looking around, and went inside. Fiora refilled her coffee cup. She had not stared. She had simply been present on her own terrace, which she had paid for, drinking her own coffee. He happened to be in her visual field. This was not a character flaw. She spent the morning exploring, which was the official purpose of the day. She walked up to the main road and down into the small center of Praiano, barely a town at all, more a collection of decisions made by generations of people who had found this cliff and thought, yes, here, and bought bread from a bakery where the woman behind the counter took one look at her and switched to deliberate, patient Italian that Fiora could follow perhaps one word in 3 of. She bought tomatoes and mozzarella from a tiny alimentari whose shelves contained approximately everything anyone could need. She sat at a table outside a bar and drank an espresso and watched the morning happen around her. A man arguing on a phone while gesturing magnificently. 2 women in black dresses exchanging news. A dog sleeping in a patch of sun with the absolute conviction of the unburdened. She bought a notebook. She had brought her professional tools, her laptop, her graphics tablet, her color calibration equipment, but she had also brought, on impulse, the kind of materials she had not used since her first year of art school. Watercolors, a set of fine-tipped pens, a sketchbook, She wanted, she realized, to simply look at things again. Not to design, not to solve visual problems, not to communicate someone else's brand values through carefully chosen color fields and typography hierarchies. Just to look at things and try to capture them by hand, without the mediation of software. It was, she suspected, what 3 years of relentless professional labor had taken from her, the simple pleasure of looking. She was back at the villa by noon, setting up her sketchbook at the terrace table with a glass of cold water and the remains of the bread and cheese she'd bought, when she heard the voice. Not from next door, from below, at the water's edge. A man's voice, speaking Italian in a low register, and then another voice responding. She didn't lean over the railing to look. She just listened for a moment to the cadence of it, the particular music of southern Italian speech, which was less the elegant precision of Tuscan Italian and more something rougher and warmer. Notes dropped from the end of words, vowels stretched and compressed in ways that no grammar book fully accounted for. Then silence, and then footsteps on the path that ran between the two properties. She looked up from her sketchbook, and there he was. He was not, at this range, slightly less striking than he had appeared from 20 meters. He was more. He stood at the low stone wall that divided their terraces. Her terrace was above his by perhaps a meter, so they were almost level, and he looked at her with those dark eyes that she now saw were not simply dark, but a very deep brown, almost black, with the quality of water at depth. "Good morning," he said, in English. His accent was Italian, precise and unhurried. He knew exactly what he was saying and had chosen these words specifically. "Good morning," she said, because this was the obvious response. A beat of silence. He had not leaned on the wall casually. He stood a few inches back from it, hands in the pockets of his dark trousers, watching her with an attention that was total and completely composed. "You arrived yesterday," he said. It was not a question. "Yesterday afternoon. You were—" She gestured vaguely toward his lower terrace. "Standing at the railing." "I was." Another silence. She was not uncomfortable in silences. She had worked in environments where a lot was communicated without speech, where ideas were often best developed in quiet. But this particular silence had a texture to it, a weight. "How long are you staying?" he asked. "A month." Something moved through his expression, too controlled and too brief to read. "I'm Fiora," she said, because standing here, not exchanging names, seemed unnecessarily mysterious. "Fiora Esposito." He looked at her name for a moment in the way that some people looked at unexpected coincidences. Then, Nero Falcone. She registered that the name was Italian. Both of them with Italian names, then, though she was third-generation American, and her Italian extended to approximately 40 words and the ability to make coffee on a mocha pot. She wondered briefly what his story was. "I should tell you," he said, "that you may hear noise sometimes, from my side. Occasionally there are people." "Likewise," she said, though she doubted she'd be causing much noise. "I'm working, mostly. I'll probably be very quiet." He looked at the sketchbook and materials on her table. "You're an artist?" "Art director. Though I'm not here for work, exactly." She paused. "I'm here to remember that I like doing it." He absorbed this in the particular way he seemed to absorb everything she said, fully, without performing reaction. "Enjoy your morning, Fiora Esposito," he said. And then he walked back down toward his own terrace, unhurried, and she watched him go because there was nothing else to do when a man like that walked away, except watch. She looked down at her sketchbook. She had been in the middle of a rough sketch of the view, the boats, the cliffs, the layered quality of the light. Without thinking about it, she added a figure at a railing. Just the shape of him, the stillness of him, the way he occupied space. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned to a fresh page and started again. By the end of the first week, Fiora had established a routine that felt, in its simplicity, almost like another life. She woke with the light, she made coffee, she sat on the terrace and drew, the sea in its morning moods, which were as variable as a personality and twice as interesting. She had pages of water studies now, the sea in silver, in rose, in the particular impossible aquamarine of 10 o'clock, when the light came at it from the right angle and turned it into something that no manufactured color could replicate precisely. She had been trying to mix it for 4 days. She was closer each morning. At 10, she allowed herself her phone. She answered emails with the brisk efficiency of someone who had developed here a very clear sense of what actually required her attention and what merely presented itself as urgent. She made 2 video calls, one to her studio assistant in Chicago, who was handling the ongoing projects, one to her best friend Sasha, who spent the entire 20 minutes demanding visual proof of beauty, and then declaring that Fiora's screen background of the view from her terrace was genuinely obscene, the kind of beauty that should be illegal. At noon, she ate. Simple things. The local tomatoes that tasted like summer had been compressed and stored inside them. Mozzarella still wet from the dairy up the road. Bread that was slightly sour and deeply satisfying. She ate at the terrace table and sometimes drew while she ate, which she had never permitted herself in Chicago because eating at a desk felt like defeat. In the afternoons, she explored. She had rented a small car for the first week, which she drove with the white-knuckled determination of someone navigating roads that were clearly not designed for cars, or possibly for anything other than very confident mountain goats, and she had made her way along the coast in both directions. Positano, which was achingly beautiful and also clearly aware of it, full of the specific beauty consciousness that came from being too frequently photographed. Ravello, higher up in the hills, where the gardens at Villa Cimbrone extended to a terrace at the edge of the world, and the air was cool and still and smelled of rose and cedar. Amalfi itself, the town that gave the coast its name, with its Arab-Norman cathedral and its paper mills and its harbor full of pleasure boats and fishing vessels in cheerful adjacency. She sketched everything. She filled pages. And in the evenings she cooked simple things in the small kitchen, opened a bottle of local white wine, and sat on the terrace until the light was gone. On the 4th evening she met Nero Falcone again properly. She had come down the path to the rocky beach below the villas, her own private access, she'd established, though it felt churlish to think of it as private when the beach was simply a ledge of flat rocks and a cove of clear, shallow water accessible to anyone willing to descend the steep path. She'd been swimming in the late afternoon, when the light was amber and the air was still warm, and she'd found that the cove was the specific shape and depth that made the water glow from below, every stone visible, every shift of light traceable. She was sitting on a flat rock, drying in the warm air, her wet hair loose on her shoulders, still slightly dazzled by the color of the water, when she heard someone on the path above. He came down with the particular care of someone who had done it many times, not uncertain, but deliberate, placing his feet with attention on the steep stone steps. He was in swim shorts again, a towel over one shoulder. He saw her when he was halfway down and stopped for just a moment, a beat of assessment so brief it might have been imagination, and then continued. "I didn't know you swam here," Fiora said. "I have a pool," he said, settling onto a rock several feet from hers, with a naturalness that suggested this beach was more his habit than she'd realized. "But the sea is different." "It is." He looked at the water. The last of the direct sunlight was gone from the cove, and the quality of light was diffuse and golden. Everything softened. "How was your week?" "Good." She meant it completely. "Better than I expected." "What did you expect?" She considered. "I thought I'd be bored after 3 days. I'm not good at stopping." He looked at her sideways, not romantically, assessingly, the way someone looked when a statement revealed something they found interesting. "What made you think you'd be bored?" "I've been working constantly for 3 years. I thought I'd forgotten how to do nothing." "And have you?" "I haven't been doing nothing," she said. "I've been drawing. But it feels like nothing compared to work. It feels like," she searched for the word, "permission." He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "Yes." She glanced at him. His eyes were still on the water, and something in his expression had shifted. The controlled surface had moved slightly, a small displacement, like a stone dropped in still water. "Do you take much time off?" she asked. "This month. Every year." A pause. "It's enough." It didn't sound like it was enough, but she didn't say that, because she had known this man for 4 days in the most superficial way possible, and making observations about the quality of his life seemed presumptuous. They swam separately and then together in an unplanned way. She went back in first, and he followed a few minutes later, and they ended up swimming parallel courses through the cove with a companionable distance between them, not talking, just moving through the same water. She was a decent swimmer. He was very good, his strokes long and economical. Watching him swim, she thought that he did everything with this same quality of self-containment, the same absence of waste. No movement unnecessary, no energy spent on performance. When they'd both emerged and were sitting on their respective rocks again, he said, "You're not staying in Positano or Ravello." "No, should I be?" "Most tourists do." A slight shift at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, but the possibility of one. Praiano is less convenient. I wanted less convenient. She pushed her wet hair back. I wanted somewhere that felt real. Positano is beautiful, but it's so aware of being beautiful. He looked at her then, fully and directly, in the way he had looked at her from across the terrace wall that first morning, a look that gave her the specific sensation of being seen, not evaluated, seen. "You're right about Positano," he said. They walked back up the path in the gathering evening, not quite together, not quite separately, and at the point where the path divided to lead to their respective properties, he paused. "There's a restaurant in the village," he said, "not on any list. Caterina runs it. 7 tables. She makes pasta e fagioli on Thursdays." "Is today Thursday?" "It is." Fiora looked at him. He was watching her with that composed expression, giving nothing away. He was not asking her to dinner. He was providing local information to a neighbor. There was a distinction. "That sounds wonderful," she said. 8 o'clock, he said. "I'll walk." She went inside and stood for a moment in her kitchen, trying to determine what precisely had just happened, and whether she was excited or alarmed or both, and whether those were even different things in this particular context. Both, she decided, definitely both. The restaurant was everything he'd described. 8 small tables covered in red-checked oilcloth, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard. A woman of perhaps 60 who emerged from the kitchen to personally confirm that yes, they still had the pasta e fagioli, and also there was branzino tonight if they wanted, caught that morning. The ceiling was hung with dried herbs and wine bottles and a string of lights that cast everything in amber. They sat across from each other, and Caterina brought wine, a local white, chilled, poured without being asked, and bread, and then the soup, which was so deeply satisfying that Fiora said nothing for a full minute after the first spoonful. "Good?" Nero asked. "Extraordinary." She looked across at him. In the light of the restaurant, he was different than he was in daylight. The severity of him was still there, but something else was too, something that the warm, amber light of a small Italian restaurant brought out in almost everyone. "Do you come here often?" "When I'm in Praiano." He drank his wine with the appreciation of someone who understood it. "Caterina knew my mother." "Your family is from here?" "From Naples, but we've had the house here for many years." He watched her over the rim of his glass. "Your name is Esposito. Your family is Italian?" "My grandparents came from Campania, actually. Salerno, my mother's parents." She smiled. "Which is why I have an Italian name and 0 Italian." "You had Italian enough to tell that Vespa driver to go ahead." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine, and he watched it happen the way you watch something rare and unexpected, with absolute stillness and full attention. "That's my entire vocabulary," she said. "Va bene and ciao and prego. And grazie. Obviously grazie." He said very quietly, "Prego." It was, strictly speaking, the correct response to an imaginary grazie, but the way he said it, with that slight particular attention, made it something else as well. An acknowledgement of something she hadn't quite said. She looked at the wine glass. The restaurant murmured around them, the other tables occupied by a couple, 2 older men playing cards at a corner table while they waited for their food, Caterina's voice from the kitchen in cheerful argument with someone back there about the branzino. "What do you do?" Fiora asked, "when you're not here?" Something crossed his face, a decision being made, so quickly it was almost invisible. "Business," he said, "various kinds." It was an answer that answered nothing, and she recognized it as deliberate. She was an art director. She spent her professional life reading what people communicated through what they chose not to say. He had given her a door marked private, with pleasant firmness. She let it go. not because she wasn't curious, but because she was intelligent enough to know that pushing at a closed door on a first dinner with a man she was going to be living next door to for a month was inadvisable. "Tell me about your work," he said. Not as a deflection, as a genuine turn, offered with that direct, full attention. So she did. She told him about the studio she'd built, the clients she worked with, the specific pleasures and frustrations of trying to communicate ideas visually. She told him about the 3 years of overwork, not the Marco part, not yet, perhaps never, but the way she'd let the work colonize everything until she'd looked up one morning and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd drawn something just because she wanted to. He listened the way he seemed to do everything, completely, without performance, without waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to draw while you're here?" "Everything," she said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment, and that almost smile was back at the corner of his mouth, and he refilled her wine glass without asking, and Caterina brought the branzino even though they hadn't ordered it. "You'll have it," she said in Italian, which Nero translated, and they stayed until the restaurant was otherwise empty. Walking back along the path in the warm dark, with the sea sounds below and the stars extraordinary overhead, he walked beside her in silence that was, remarkably, the most comfortable silence she had been in for years. At her door, she said, "Thank you for the recommendation." "Prego," he said again, just that, and turned and walked toward his own door. She went inside and stood in her kitchen in the dark for a long moment. Then she found her sketchbook and drew him from memory, quickly, just the outline of him in the amber restaurant light. The line of his jaw, the particular quality of his attention. She didn't analyze why she did this. She simply did it, the way you recorded things you wanted to keep. Enzo Ricci delivered his report on the second morning, as was customary. He did not come to the villa. He called on the secure line at 7:15, while Nero was still in the pool, which meant Nero stood dripping at the pool's edge, with the phone pressed to his ear and the morning light coming up over the sea, and thought about what he was hearing. Fiora Esposito, 28 years old, born in Chicago. Parents are Antonio and Lucia Esposito, both teachers. Her grandparents were Compagnon, Salerno specifically. She has a design studio, works as a freelance art director for brand clients. Medium-sized operation, she runs it essentially alone since a professional partnership dissolved 18 months ago. No criminal record anywhere in any jurisdiction. No associations of concern. Enzo paused. She is exactly what she appears to be. "I see," Nero said. Another brief pause, the kind Enzo allowed himself when he had a thought he was weighing whether to share. "She arrived alone. She's booked the rental for 4 weeks. According to the rental agency, she paid in full up front." He paused again, more deliberately. "Shall I arrange to have the rental reassigned? There are other properties in Priano." Nero looked at the villa on the terrace above his. Her window was open. The white curtains moved in the sea air. "No," he said, "as you say. I want someone on the road access above, full time. Quiet, no visible presence. Of course." He set down the phone and swam another 10 laps with the particular efficiency of a man trying to not think about something by thinking about something else entirely. The facts were simple. She was a civilian, an American tourist with Italian roots and a design studio, and 3 years of overwork from which she was recovering. She posed no conceivable security concern. She knew nothing about him, except that he was a wealthy Italian man with a large house on the Amalfi Coast, which told her approximately nothing significant. She had looked at his professional deflection the previous evening, recognized it for what it was, and had the intelligence and good manners to let it pass. She was interesting. More interesting than he had expected, and he had expected nothing, because she was simply a neighbor and a complication, and he should have arranged for her to be moved to a different rental, and instead he had told Enzo no without thinking about it. This was, Nero acknowledged, information. He ran the house alone, by preference. He had staff in Naples, a housekeeper, a driver, the members of his organization who moved through his life as required. But here, he maintained the fiction of an ordinary, wealthy man on holiday. He cooked his own meals. He drove himself. He answered his own door. It was the one place in his life where the machinery of what he was did not surround him visibly. He had had relationships, not none, 2 women over the years since he'd taken over his organization, who had been intelligent and composed, and had understood, without him having to articulate it, that there were parts of his life that would remain separate. Both had eventually found the separation too complete. He understood why. He had not been able to offer what they needed, and had chosen not to try to manufacture what he did not have, which was, he thought, at minimum, honest. He was not, therefore, looking for anything. He was on holiday. She was a neighbor. He found himself, that afternoon, aware of the sounds from her terrace with a specificity that was completely involuntary. The scratch of a pen on paper, the soft sound of a brush being rinsed in water. At one point, a small exclamation, something between frustration and delight, that might have been the response to a color being achieved. At 4 o'clock, he came out to his own terrace with the specific intention of reading, which he had been meaning to do all afternoon, and she was sitting at her table with her back to him, and her dark hair loose now rather than up, and she was sketching the sea with a concentration that was entirely oblivious to his presence. He sat down. He opened his book. He read the same page 4 times. She turned at some point, not because of him, but because she was shifting her perspective on whatever she was drawing, and found him there, and something moved across her face that she didn't bother to hide. Something warm. Not performance warm, not social warm, but the real thing, the kind that showed up in people's eyes before they had time to decide whether to show it. "Reading?" she said. Attempting. She looked at the book, Sebald, The Rings of Saturn, which she tilted her head to read the title of. Heavy for a holiday. "It's about walking," he said. "It's about grief and memory and the ruins of things." He looked at her. She looked back with a slight expression that said she was aware of having said something unexpectedly direct, but was not apologizing for it. "Also walking," he said. She almost smiled, turned back to her sketchbook. "What are you grieving?" she asked, very casually, in the tone of someone who knew they were asking something they had no right to, and was asking anyway on the grounds that the directness might be interesting. He considered, genuinely, whether to answer. "Nothing in particular," he said. Which was both true and untrue in the way that most honest answers were. "And you?" A pause. She was mixing something on her palette, not looking at him. "I lost a few years to work," she said. "Which isn't grief exactly, but it's something. A mourning for ordinary time." "Yes." She looked up, and the surprise in her face was unguarded. Exactly that. They looked at each other across the wall between their terraces in the warm afternoon light, and Nero felt something he had not felt in a considerable time, the specific quality of being understood by someone who did not know him well enough to have predicted what he would say. It was dangerous. He knew immediately that it was dangerous, in the specific way that things were dangerous when they could displace your judgment. He had learned a long time ago to identify these things quickly and assess them with clarity. He looked back at his book. He did not, this time, read the same page 4 times. He read nothing at all. In Naples, the machinery continued without him. His second in command, a man called Caruso, who was meticulous and discreet, and had been with the Falcone organization since before Nero had taken it over, called at 6. "The Gennaro matter," Caruso said. "Has it resolved?" "Substantially. The dispute over the Pozzuoli arrangements has been settled. There may be a residual issue with the... I'll send it to you tonight. It doesn't require your presence." "Good. There's also news from Rome. Nothing urgent. The Testa family is making certain inquiries about expansion toward the south. I've been monitoring." "Keep monitoring. Don't respond yet. I want to see where the inquiries lead before we determine whether they're preliminary interest or a probe." "Understood." A pause. "You're well?" It was a practiced inquiry, Caruso being one of the few people in Nero's life who asked such things and meant them. "I'm well," Nero said. "I'll call you Thursday." He ended the call and stood in his kitchen for a moment in the evening quiet, the line between what he was and where he was very clear and very maintained. This was how it worked. The villa was not separate from his life. Nothing in his life was truly separate from the organization. That would be naive. But it was cleanly partitioned. The people who needed to know where he was knew where he was. The people who didn't. The woman next door, who had quoted Sebald at him with casual precision and drawn the sea every morning and eaten Katerina's pasta with the expression of someone receiving exactly the right thing at the right moment, she did not know and would not know, and that was simply the way it was. He opened his refrigerator, looked at it, and decided to go to Katerina's. He did not knock on the door of the neighboring villa to ask if she wanted to come. He went alone, ate branzino and drank a glass of wine, nodded to Katerina, who looked at him with the sharp eyes of a woman who had been watching men behave like idiots for 60 years and could identify the early symptoms, and came home in the dark. He passed her terrace on the way up the path. A single light was on inside. He could hear, very faintly, music, something slow, something jazz, the kind of music that came from someone who treated silence as something to be shaped rather than avoided. He went inside and did not listen for it. He listened for it anyway. The days shaped themselves around small rituals, the way good days tend to. Fiora had been in Priano for 12 days and had established, without quite deciding to, a life that bore no resemblance to her life in Chicago and required almost none of the things she'd thought she needed. She did not miss her gym, her coffee shop, her network of professional acquaintances, or the particular serotonin spike of a successful client presentation. She missed, occasionally, Sasha, but Sasha had texted a series of escalating demands for photographic evidence of progress with the Italian, and Fiora had responded only with a photograph of her sketchbook open to a page of water studies, which was accurate and also uninformative. There was no Italian. There was a neighbor. Except that the neighbor had developed a presence in her day that was difficult to categorize. She had seen him on the path twice, and they had exchanged the kind of courteous good mornings that neighbors exchanged. She had heard him swimming in the early mornings. She had seen him on his terrace in the evenings, reading, occasionally on the phone, and she had allowed herself to notice him the way you allowed yourself to notice beautiful things: the sunset, the water, the movement of the wisteria in the afternoon breeze. Not staring, appreciating. She had not been back to Katerina's restaurant. This was a decision she had not quite consciously made, but had arrived at by some back channel of instinct. The dinner had been the beginning of something. She was not naive enough to misread what it had been, and she was also not entirely sure that something was wise. He was guarded in a way that went beyond ordinary reticence. There were doors she'd sensed that first evening that went several stories deep. The warmth she occasionally caught in his expression existed in genuine tension with a quality that she could only describe as controlled remoteness, as if he'd decided long ago that certain things required keeping separate, and had enforced this so thoroughly that it had become structural. She found him interesting. That was the honest formulation. She was also here to reclaim herself from a period in which she had given herself entirely over to something that had not deserved it, and she was not yet confident enough in her reclaimed self to introduce complications. So, the path, the good mornings, the companionable parallel occupation of their respective terraces. On the 13th day, she came back from her afternoon swim in the cove to find a lemon tree branch on the wall between their terraces, with 3 perfect lemons still attached. There was no note. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took it inside and made lemonade and left 1 glass on the wall where the branch had been. When she went out later, the glass was gone. She was smiling as she went to bed. She told herself this was disproportionate. On the 14th day, Sasha called. "I need you to promise me something," Sasha said by way of hello. Sasha was 31, a corporate lawyer in Chicago who had the specific gift of treating every conversation as if it were a legal proceeding in which she was also the judge. "Good morning, Sasha." "It's afternoon there. Promise me you're not just drawing and being solitary. I need you to be talking to at least 1 human being per day." "I talked to the woman at the bakery, Signora Rinaldi. She's teaching me the Italian word for each kind of bread." "That doesn't count." "I talked to my neighbor." A pause that could only be described as legally significant. "The neighbor," Sasha said slowly. "Is this the neighbor from the photographs?" "I haven't sent you photographs of my neighbor." "No, but when I asked you to describe your rental situation, you described it in extreme detail that happened to include the architecture of the adjacent property, and I drew certain inferences." Fiora looked at the terrace wall. "He's a neighbor. He's Italian and private, and I don't know anything about him, and we exchange civilities, and it's fine. He's attractive. I didn't say that. Your reluctance to say it is itself very informative. A beat. Be careful, Fiora. I'm always careful. You are emphatically not always careful. You spent 2 years working exclusively with Marco in a studio that was also your apartment, and you called that professional judgment. I'm familiar with your relationship with Caution. That was different. Different how? Fiora looked at the water. Marco was familiar. This is... whatever this is, it's not that. What is it? She thought of the lemons on the wall, the almost smile, the way he had listened to her talking about her work in the amber light of the restaurant, with an attention that had felt like being taken seriously in the most complete way. I genuinely don't know, she said. That might be worse, said Sasha. He came over that evening. Not to her door. He came to the terrace wall at 6 o'clock, which was the hour when she was usually outside, and stood there with 2 glasses in his hand. My wine, he said, holding one out across the wall. From the place in Praiano, the Greco di Tufo. She took it, sat back in her chair. He leaned, this time, against the wall. The first time she'd seen him actually lean against anything, the first concession to informality she'd witnessed. How was your day? She asked. Quiet. He drank his wine. You went down to the cove. I do every afternoon. You swim well. I grew up on Lake Michigan, she said. My father basically lived on the water in summer. I've been swimming since I was 4. He looked at the sea. I never learned properly until I was 15, he said. I grew up in the city. The sea was something you looked at. She stored this. Naples, she thought. Or somewhere else urban and southern. The Quartieri, maybe. Something about the way he held the particular memory of the sea as a spectacle rather than a place suggested a specific kind of city childhood. Did you have a good childhood? She asked, and then felt immediately that this was an overstep. He considered the question with the thoroughness he gave everything, which suggested it was not a simple question for him. Parts of it, he said. My mother was extraordinary. My father was... A pause. Demanding. In a bad way? In a complicated way. He glanced at her. You? Genuinely good, she said, and meant it. My parents were... ordinary, in the best sense. My father read to me every night until I was 12. My mother had a garden. We went to the lake every summer. She paused. I think I've been trying to get back to that simplicity for years, without realizing that was what I was trying to do. He was looking at her with that full attention again. Is that what this... He gestured at her, the terrace, the sketchbook visible on the table. What this is about? Partly, she smiled. It's also about the pasta e fagioli. Don't underestimate the pasta e fagioli. He laughed. She had not heard him laugh before. It was low and brief and genuine, and it changed his face entirely, opening something that the controlled expression usually kept closed. He looked younger for a moment. He looked like someone who had once laughed easily and had learned for specific reasons to ration it. She looked at him for a moment too long, and he caught her doing it, and neither of them said anything. He stayed until the light was gone from the sea, and the first stars appeared, and the night brought its warm, particular darkness to the terrace, and they talked about small things. The view from Ravello she'd visited, the local wine, the way the cliffs looked in different kinds of light, and he was careful with her in a way she noticed, careful and also, beneath the care, interested. The interest was not performed. It was the real kind, the kind that made you pay attention to what someone said because you actually wanted to know what they said. When he left, she did not say, "Come back tomorrow." But he did. On the 17th day, something cracked. Not between them, nothing dramatic or definitive. But Fiora was sitting on her terrace in the late morning, her sketchbook open, trying to capture the exact moment when the sea shifted from deep blue to turquoise as the sun moved to a certain angle, which was a problem of light that she'd been approaching from the wrong direction, and had just now, she thought, found the right one, when she heard it. 2 cars on the road above. Which was not unusual, but then voices, men's voices, and the particular quality of lowered speech that contained urgency, and then silence. Then footsteps on the path, multiple footsteps, heavier and more deliberate than Nero's usual unhurried gait. She didn't look up immediately. She continued mixing her color, testing it on the corner of the page. Then she heard his voice, low and short, in Italian, and 3 other voices responding, and she glanced over to his terrace. There were 4 men on his lower terrace. 3 were unfamiliar, dark-suited despite the heat, which was itself a statement, standing in the way that large men stood when their size was part of their professional function. The 4th was Nero. He was not wearing his usual summer linen. He had changed into something darker, and his posture was completely different than the posture she was accustomed to. The contained quality she'd noticed from the first day was still there, but the warmth that occasionally surfaced in it, in the evenings, over wine, in conversation, was gone entirely. He stood among these men like the center of a structure, like a column that everything else referenced. He was speaking quietly and not looking in her direction. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. The 3 men left. One of them, the largest, with the watchful eyes of someone whose entire function was to monitor surroundings, looked up at Fiora's terrace as he passed, briefly, with the mechanical attention of a security camera. She looked down at her sketchbook. When she looked up again, Nero was alone on his terrace, looking out at the sea. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was arranged in the closed expression she'd seen very early on, the expression that had been gradually and partially replaced, over 17 days, with something that had slightly more give in it. He must have felt her gaze. He turned, and their eyes met across the wall. She made a decision, which was to simply hold his gaze without interpretation or alarm. She had seen something she hadn't been intended to see, or hadn't been considered, which told her something. He had not thought to exclude her, or had not cared to, which might mean she was of no concern, or might mean he was comfortable enough with her presence that he'd forgotten to be vigilant about it. He came to the wall. He was, up close, looking at her with an expression that was searching, reading her, reading what she'd seen, reading what she made of it. "Business," she said, using his word from the restaurant. Something shifted in him. Not relief, exactly. More like a recalibration. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said, and looked back at her sketchbook. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're not concerned." "Should I be?" He said nothing. "I grew up in Chicago," she said. "I've seen powerful men and the people who attend them. I've had clients who run large organizations and have security details. I'm an adult, Nero. I'm not under any illusion that the world is a simple place." He was looking at her in a way that was different from all the previous ways. Something concentrated and almost uncomfortable in it, as if she'd done something he hadn't anticipated, and the adjustment required focus. "You're perceptive," he said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, or wasn't only that. There was a weight to it. "I'm an art director," she said. "I read visual environments for a living. I'm also, for what it's worth, not interested in things that are not my business. You haven't asked me about my work, and I haven't asked about yours. You asked what I did at dinner, and you said business, various kinds, and I let it go." He was still looking at her with that concentrated expression. Then, slowly, the concentration shifted to something else, something that she would not have dared to name, but that occupied the space just adjacent to admiration. "Come for dinner," he said. "Tonight. I'll cook." She looked up at him fully. It was the most specific invitation he'd made. Not a restaurant, not a walk, not wine on the terrace. His house. His kitchen. "What will you make?" she asked. "Spaghetti alle vongole." A pause. "My mother's recipe." She looked at him for a moment. "What time?" 8. She nodded once and went back to her painting, and did not examine too carefully why her heart was doing what it was doing. His house was, up close, even more beautiful than it had appeared from a distance. The interior was minimal in the way of spaces that had been designed with intention. White plaster walls, polished stone floors, furniture that was simple and expensive and functional. There were books everywhere, which surprised her, stacked on shelves and on surfaces in the specific disorder of books that were actually being read rather than displayed. There was art, not decorative, not brand-conscious, but the real thing. 2 prints she recognized as Alighiero Boetti, a small bronze on a table near the window that she leaned closer to examine and found was a Giacometti, not a print. "You like art," she said. "I like things made with intention," he said, from the kitchen doorway, where he was, actually, genuinely, cooking. She sat at the kitchen island and watched him cook, which was something she hadn't expected. He moved through the kitchen with the same economical competence he brought to everything, but there was a different quality to it here, something not quite relaxed, but less defended. He opened clams with the practiced hand of someone who'd done it many times. He built the sauce with attention, adding wine, watching the reduction. "Your mother taught you?" she asked. "My mother taught me everything worth knowing," he said. There was nothing sentimental in the way he said it, but everything was in it. "Is she... She died 11 years ago." "I'm sorry," he looked at her. "So am I." He stirred the pasta. "She would have liked you." She didn't know what to do with that. She sat with it. They ate at the table on his lower terrace, with the sea below them and the stars above, and the spaghetti alla vongole was the best she'd ever eaten. Not because the recipe was complex, but because every element was exactly right. The clams briny and sweet, the pasta at the precise margin of done, the whole thing shining with good olive oil and brightened with a quantity of parsley. "This is extraordinary," she said. "It's simple," he said, but he looked pleased, briefly, quickly, a small thing. Over the second glass of wine, she said, "May I ask you something?" He looked at her across the table. "You can ask." "Are you actually on holiday? It feels like," she searched for the word, "like you're here, and also not completely here. Like there's another frequency running under the surface." He looked at the sea for a moment, then back at her. "Perceptive," he said again. "You said that already. It keeps being applicable." She waited. "I'm here," he said, "and there is..." a pause. "Work that doesn't stop entirely, but I am here." He looked at her in the particular way she was beginning to recognize as his most honest expression. Not the social face, not the closed face, not the careful, strategic face she suspected he wore in most of his life. Just his face. "I am more here than I have been in a very long time." She held that, set down her wine glass. "Because of the sea?" she asked. "Among other things," he said, and looked at her, and didn't look away. She felt the warmth of the evening, the wine, the sound of water below, the stars, and him. And something that had been very carefully contained for 17 days, by both of them, stretched and shifted and pressed against its boundaries. She looked away first, not because she didn't want to look at him, but because she needed to think, and she couldn't think when he looked at her like that. "I should go," she said after a while. He walked her to the path between their properties and stood there in the warm dark, not quite close enough to be anything other than considerate, and said, "Good night, Fiora." She turned back once, at her door. He was still standing there. He didn't move until she was inside. She was painting the sea again, which was the ongoing project, the one she had begun to think of as her central work for this month. Not a series of studies, but something more sustained, an attempt to understand the water. It was day 20, and she had 17 sheets covered, and each one showed her something different about what she was looking for and how she hadn't yet found it. The problem was light. Not literally. The light here was extraordinary, the kind that painters had been making pilgrimages to the Mediterranean for centuries to access, that specific quality of southern European sun that did not merely illuminate but penetrated, that turned ordinary color into something incandescent. The problem was that she was trying to paint something that was partly light and partly water and partly a feeling, and feelings were not cooperative subjects. She had, she was beginning to understand, been trying to paint the sensation of being here, of being present, after years of not being present, of having the surface of the world admit its beauty to you again. Sasha had texted, "Update me on the situation immediately." Fiora had replied, "Nothing to update." Sasha, "Incorrect. Something is happening and you are processing it in your artistic medium instead of calling your best friend. This is classic Fiora avoidance behavior." Fiora, "I'm going to have dinner at his house tonight." Sasha, "What?" Fiora, again, for the second time. "We're eating pasta and talking, and that's all that's happening."
"What does he do?"
"He says business, various kinds." A long pause. "That is exactly what a hot criminal says. Those are criminal words, Fiora. I want you to know I'm a lawyer, and I am professionally identifying this as a red flag. You're a corporate lawyer. You draft merger agreements. I watch a lot of television. Be careful. Fiora had set down her phone and gone back to her painting and tried not to think about the phrase hot criminal, which was unhelpful. The dinners had become a thing. Not every night. They had not, somehow, slid into every night, which she suspected was deliberate on his part, a calibration. Every 2 or 3 nights, one of them would appear at the terrace wall at 6 o'clock with wine, and the evening would proceed from there, either to Katerina's or to his kitchen, or, once, to a longer walk up through the village to a promontory where you could see the entire arc of coast in the gathering dark. On the promontory walk, they had stood side by side, looking at the lights appearing one by one along the coast, Positano, a cluster of warm yellow across the water, the lighthouse beams sweeping from Punta Licosa in the far south, and she had said, without planning to, I feel like I've been living in a very small room for years, and someone just opened a door. He had looked at her for a long moment. What was the room? Work. The studio. The idea of what I was building. A pause. A relationship that I gave too much to for too long, and that I'm still carrying the shape of it, even though it's gone. It was the most she'd said about Marco to anyone, even Sasha, in 18 months. She didn't know why she was saying it to him, except that his quality of attention made honesty feel not like exposure, but like accuracy. He said, carefully, What happened? He left. We'd been together 4 years, working together 3, and he just left, both, at once. She looked at the lights on the water. The professional loss was almost worse. That's the part I haven't admitted to anyone, that the person I missed most was my business partner, not my boyfriend. What does that say about the relationship? It says the relationship was not the thing you thought it was. Or that I'm not capable of... No. He said it quietly and with complete conviction. It says the relationship was not the thing you thought it was. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that was entirely direct and also somehow careful, the care of someone who knows they're saying something that matters. She looked back at the lights. Later, walking down from the promontory, on the narrow path where the cliff fell away on one side, she had stumbled slightly on a loose stone. His hand had been at her elbow before she'd registered losing her balance, fast and sure, the grip of someone with reflexes trained to precision. And then she was steady, and his hand was still there for 3 steps, 4, and then was gone. Neither of them mentioned it. But she had been very aware, for the rest of the walk, of the distance between them. On day 22, a boat arrived. She was at the cove, on her flat rock, when she saw it come around the headland, a large motorboat, white and sleek, the kind of vessel that announced money without displaying it. It anchored in the small bay beyond the cove, not visible from the villas above, and a dinghy came ashore with 2 men. She watched them come up the path. They were dressed like the others from 17 days ago, dark despite the heat, with the contained alertness of people who were always professional. She went back to her rock and her watercolor and did not watch them pass. When she came back up to her villa an hour later, Nero was at the terrace wall. He looked different. Not alarmed. But something in the careful surface of him was under a different kind of pressure. His jaw was slightly set. His eyes, when they found her, had an intensity that went beyond their usual depth. The boat, she said. Business, he said, the word between them again. It's concluded. Are you all right? Something moved through his expression. Surprise, quickly managed. People did not, she suspected, ask him this. Yes, he said. She looked at him. You look tired. I am, occasionally. She turned and went inside her villa. She came back with the remains of a bottle of the local white and 2 glasses and set them both on the terrace wall. He looked at them, then at her. He poured. They stood on their respective sides of the wall in the warm afternoon and drank wine and said very little. And it was, she would think about this later, the specific quality of this particular stillness. It was, she realized, companionship. The real kind. The kind that didn't require performance or entertainment or the management of impression, but simply the shared occupancy of a moment. When the wine was done, he said, "Thank you." She said, "What for?" He looked at the sea. for being here," he said, very quietly. She did not say the obvious, which was that she was not going anywhere. She simply took her glass inside and let the evening come. She drew him on day 24, properly. Not the quick gesture drawing in her sketchbook, not the silhouette she'd done from memory that first evening. A real drawing, worked over 2 hours on a large sheet of watercolor paper, using her finest pen and building the image slowly, the way she'd been trained, observation and restraint, and the discipline of not rushing toward what you thought you saw. She did it without his knowledge, working from a position on her terrace where she could see him on his below, sitting in the shade of the pergola with a book and a cup of coffee, in the mid-morning quiet. He had his back partially to her, and she could see his profile, and the quality of his stillness in that particular posture, the contained ease of a man who was, for this hour, not required to be anything in particular. She worked slowly. She took wrong lines and let them be, because sometimes the wrong lines were part of how you found the right ones. She noted, without judgment, that she knew his face now well enough to draw it without looking, the specific proportion of jaw to brow, the way his dark hair grew, the line of his shoulders. She had been paying attention, it turned out, at a granular level. The drawing was very good, better than she'd expected. It captured something about him, the specific combination of power and restraint, the sense of a person who occupied space with intention, who was never accidental. She looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the sketchbook. That evening, at dinner, his kitchen again, a slow-cooked pork with fennel that he'd been working on since noon, she said, quite suddenly, into a silence, "I drew you today." He looked up from the stove. Something in his expression shifted. Not displeasure, but a quality of alert attention, the way a person looked when something unexpected reached them. "Did you?" he said. "You were reading in the pergola." He was quiet for a moment, tending the pot with a focus that might have been genuine culinary attention, or might have been something to do with his hands. "Can I see it?" She considered this. "Maybe," she said. "Not tonight." He looked at her. She looked back. The not yet of it, the deliberate pause, created a specific kind of tension that they both felt and neither named. "You have a very architectural quality," she said. "When you're still, you occupy space like a structure, like something that was built with purpose." He turned away from the stove fully and looked at her with an expression that was unguarded in a way she'd not seen before. Not the warm moments she'd glimpsed, but something rawer than that. Something that looked, briefly, like a man who had been seen. "People don't usually—" He stopped. "Say things like that? Observe things like that." "I look for a living," she said, "and you're interesting to look at." The last words came out with slightly more directness than she'd intended, or perhaps exactly as much as she'd intended, and she'd simply not admitted it. He absorbed them, and something in the room shifted, or the air between them, which had been calibrated for days at a precise and managed temperature, moved by a degree. "Fiora," he said. "Yes?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she was aware of her own breath, of the sound of the sea through the open window, of the smell of fennel and wine and the warm stone of the villa. He was deciding something, she could see it. Something that required actual deliberation, not instinct. Whatever he usually was in this kind of moment, he was not being it now. "Nothing," he said finally, and turned back to the stove. She looked at the curve of his back, at the line of his shoulders, at the particular way he held himself, even in this domestic posture, even cooking at a stove, like something that could not be completely at rest. She thought, "I am in very significant trouble." And then she thought, "I have been for approximately 3 weeks." They ate and talked about the south of Italy, the specific character of Campanian culture, which he described with the detailed affection of someone who had grown up inside it and loved it without being blind to it. He told her about the quartieri in Naples, the neighborhood of his childhood, and she listened and asked questions, and he answered with a precision that told her these memories were carefully organized rather than freely accessed, chosen, not simply offered. He told her about a market near where he'd grown up, where you could buy fish that had been in the sea 6 hours before, and how his mother had gone every Saturday morning, and how the fishmonger's wife had taught him, at 7, to tell the difference between a fish that was fresh and one that merely looked it. "That seems like a useful life skill," Fiora said. "It's a Naples life skill," he said. "In Naples you learn to tell the difference between what is real And what is presentation? She looked at him. Did you? He met her eyes. Eventually, he said, not always in time. She thought about this for the rest of the evening, and was still thinking about it when she lay in bed in her rented villa, with the window open and the sea sounds coming in and the night warm, and the thought of him, on the other side of a shared wall, not sleeping either. She was almost certain he was not sleeping. She closed her eyes and thought, this is the part where you decide. She fell asleep before she'd decided anything, which was itself a decision. On day 26, a man named Philippe Renard arrived in Priano. She didn't know his name immediately. She met him in the ordinary way of small places, at Katerina's, where she'd gone alone for lunch, and he was at the next table with a glass of local rosé and an easy French-accented English, and the confidence of a man who had been handsome for long enough that social ease had followed naturally. He was 35 or so, blonde, well-dressed in that European way that was casual and expensive simultaneously. He worked, he said, in finance. Not unspecific in the way Nero was unspecific, but with the cheerful transparency of someone who found his own profession moderately interesting and expected others to feel the same. He was based in Paris, had rented a villa in Positano for a week, had come to Priano on the recommendation of someone at his hotel. It's better here, Fiora said. You've been here a while? 3.5 weeks. I have a villa near the water. She considered. I'm an art director. American, he said, with pleasure. I love Americans in Europe. You look at everything like it's remarkable. It is remarkable. He smiled at that, a warm, unguarded smile, with nothing strategic in it. Exactly. Yes. Come, are you having lunch? Let me buy you lunch. I've been talking to my phone for 3 days, and I find I desperately need a human being. She had lunch with him, which was pleasant and uncomplicated, in the way that encounters between strangers in beautiful places were pleasant and uncomplicated. He was funny and self-deprecating and genuinely curious about her work. He did not give her the sensation of being studied. He gave her the sensation of being enjoyed, which was different and considerably simpler. They had a second glass of wine. Katerina looked at her, once, with an expression she couldn't interpret. Do you want to see the cove below the village? Fiora said. It's extraordinary. I would love to see the cove below the village, said Philippe Renard. She took him down the path, not the private steps to her villa's beach, but the public access further along, and he was, genuinely, arrested by the sight of it. The layered water, the particular angle of light through the shallow rock shelf that made the color glow from below. Remarkable, he said, with feeling. She liked him. In the simple way she liked people who were genuinely present and meant what they said. They parted at the top of the path, exchanged numbers in case he came back through Priano, and she walked back to her villa in the warm afternoon in a good mood, thinking only that it had been a pleasant afternoon with a pleasant person. She was back on her terrace, sketchbook open, when she heard the voice. Who was that? Nero was at the terrace wall. He was in the posture of someone who had been there for a while, leaning now, which she'd learned to read as something between casualness and effort, him trying to look less pointed than he was. But his eyes were not casual. His eyes had a quality she hadn't seen in them before, a darkness that had weight in it. His name is Philippe, she said. I met him at Katerina's. He's French, visiting from Positano. You spent 3 hours with him. She set down her pen. Did I? She looked at him steadily. I didn't realize I was on a schedule. A muscle moved in his jaw. You're not. Good. She picked up the pen again. He was nice. I had lunch. Nothing interesting. Silence. She could feel the particular quality of it. Not the comfortable kind, not the companionable kind, but the kind that contained something being held back by sheer will. Nero, she said, without looking up. Yes. If you have something to say, say it. Another silence. Then, very quiet. I don't have anything to say. She looked up at him then. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was completely controlled, and also not controlled at all in the way that mattered. She had been observing him for 26 days, and she knew, with the precision of someone who had been paying attention, that the control was working very hard right now. She thought, he is jealous. And then immediately thought, he has no right to be jealous. And then thought, but the fact that he is anyway. She set down the pen. There is nothing to be concerned about, she said, clearly and directly. In regard to Philippe. He looked at her. Something eased, slightly, in the line of his shoulders, a fraction, barely visible. Then, I know that. It's not... He stopped. Not what? He said nothing for a moment, and then, with the deliberate quality of someone making a careful choice, come to dinner. Tonight? Yes. She looked at him for a moment. The light was doing something complicated behind him, turning the sea rose gold, and he stood against it with that particular quality of his, the weight and stillness of him, and she thought, here it is then. Here is the decision, delivered again, the one she hadn't made in bed 3 nights ago. 8 o'clock, she said. He nodded once, pushed off the wall, and went inside. She looked at the sea for a long time. Then she went to the small mirror in her bathroom and looked at herself, and thought with honest simplicity, you already know what you want. The question is what to do about it. She went to dinner. He had made cacio e pepe, which was either the simplest pasta in Italy or the most technically demanding, depending on who you asked, and he had made it exactly right. The sauce clinging to the rigatoni in tight ribbons, the pepper serious without being punishing, the cheese emulsified to silk. She told him it was perfect. He said it was merely competent. She said, you have a problem with receiving compliments. He looked at her across the table. I prefer accuracy. Then accurately, it's extraordinary. Better than anything I've had in any restaurant. She looked at the plate. My grandmother would have cried. Something in him softened at this, at the mention of her grandmother, of the line that ran from this plate through her history to a woman in Salerno who had cooked for people she loved. She would have found it impure, he said. Every Italian grandmother believes her own version is the only correct one. She's right. Her version probably was the only correct one. Fiora looked up. Do you cook for people often? No. A pause. Not here. In Naples there are occasions, formal things. The quality of his tone on the word formal was not dismissive, but it was careful. But not like this. Not like this, he agreed. She was aware, over the rest of the meal, of a new texture in the evening. They had been building something over these 4 weeks, she and this man, through accumulation, through the small daily exchange of presents, the wine on the terrace wall, the conversations in the amber restaurant light, the companionable silence of 2 people who had found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that the other's quiet was the right kind of quiet. But tonight was different. The jealousy, which he hadn't named and she hadn't directly named, but which had been entirely present, had moved something, or removed something. A layer of careful management. After dinner, he took 2 glasses of wine out to the lower terrace, his own terrace, facing the sea. She followed. They stood at the railing. Below, the sea was dark and quiet, moonlight on it in a long silver road. The air was warm and perfectly still, that rare August stillness when even the sea seemed to hold its breath. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her sideways. Something you don't usually tell people, she said. Something real. He was quiet for a moment. She waited, not helping him, letting the question stand. I've been happy this month, he said. Genuinely. More than I can... He stopped, tried again. There are parts of my life that require a kind of severance from ordinary things, and I accepted that a long time ago. I built a life that was, he chose the word carefully, sufficient. She was watching him, listening. This, he gestured at the sea, or at her, or at both, which were not so different tonight. This has felt like something I forgot I was allowed to want. She looked at the sea for a moment, then, quietly, what did you want, before you forgot? This, he said, and meant it simply, the evening, the water, a person beside him in the warm dark who was real and present and knew, somehow, without the full story, what the cost of things had been. She turned toward him. He was already looking at her, not toward her, but at her, fully, with the quality she'd been aware of for a long time now, the attention that was entirely his own, unperformed, unmanaged. She reached up and touched his face. Just once, with her fingers at his jaw, the gesture of someone who had been wanting to do a thing and has decided, finally, to do it. He was very still. His hands at his sides did not move, but his eyes, dark and complete, closed briefly and then opened. "Fiora," he said. Just her name. The way he said it was a sentence. "I know," she said, because she did know. She knew that this was complicated, and she knew that there were rooms in him she couldn't enter, and she knew that this particular month was a world out of time, a parenthesis, and she knew that what came after the parenthesis was unclear at best. She knew all of this with perfect clarity. She kissed him anyway. He was careful at first. The control of a man who had been exercising control for a long time and did not immediately abandon it, even in the presence of something he wanted. But then she felt it. The moment the control shifted, became something else. The same quality, but redirected. Toward her. Toward this. Toward the specific warmth and pressure of her mouth, and the fact of her being here on his terrace in the dark. His hands found her waist. The particular way he held her was, like the rest of him, like everything about him, deliberate, complete. When they drew back, the night was exactly as it had been. Sea and moon and the warm air and the lights along the coast, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, entirely open, all the careful layers set down. He looked like himself, she thought. Whatever he was beneath the weight of his life, this was it. "I didn't mean for this," he began. "I know," she said again. "I don't—" He stopped. "Nero." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not asking you for anything you can't give me. I'm simply here." He looked at her for a long moment, and something that had been very carefully guarded for a very long time, moved in his expression, and was admitted. He brought her back inside. They stayed on his terrace until almost midnight, talking quietly in the warm dark, bodies close but unhurried, as if now that the distance had been crossed, they could afford to take their time. The moon completed its arc. The sea continued its ancient indifference to all human drama below. She went back to her own villa at midnight, barefoot on the stone path, the night air warm on her skin, and she lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling and thought that she had either done something very right or something very complicated. She thought probably both. He did not sleep. This was not unusual. He slept in the way of people who had trained themselves to rest efficiently rather than deeply. 4 hours, 5, waking with his mind already organized and operational. But this particular sleeplessness was different. He lay in the dark and listened to the sea, and thought about the woman asleep in the villa above his, and found that his usual ability to assess things with clinical detachment had been, for the moment, decommissioned. He had known, from the moment she had settled into that villa and looked at him from her terrace with those unguarded dark eyes, that she was a problem. Not a threat. He had been careful and exact about that distinction. But a problem in the sense that she was the kind of woman who required something he had been organized for a very long time not to require. His life was not compatible with what had happened on that terrace tonight. He turned this over in his mind with the careful honesty he owed himself. He had taken the Falcone organization at 27. He had built it into something stable and self-perpetuating, and had done so through specific choices about what he would and would not permit in his personal life. The women before had understood, at some level, that he was not available in the complete sense, that there was a portion of his life that would remain both hidden and determining, and that any relationship would exist in the space not occupied by that portion. Both of them had found it too small a space, eventually. He had decided, at some point, that this was simply the nature of his life and the cost of what he was and what he did, and he had made peace with it the way you made peace with structural facts. And then this particular American woman had arrived with her sketchbook and her direct questions and her way of offering honesty as if it were an ordinary thing rather than a calculated risk, and had spent a month building a slow and entirely voluntary proximity, and had kissed him on his terrace in the dark with a clarity and simplicity that was... He got up. He made coffee. He stood at his kitchen window in the dark and looked at the vine-covered wall and thought about what he was doing. The problem was not that he wanted her. The problem was that he wanted her in the specific way that rendered his usual architecture of separation inadequate. He wanted her the way you wanted something that you would have to rearrange yourself to have, rather than simply accommodate in the existing structure. He had not wanted anything like that in a very long time. He called Enzo at 6 in the morning, which was slightly early even for Enzo, who answered on the second ring with the equanimity of someone who had been awake already. "Is there anything I should know about?" Nero said, "in terms of exposure? Our current situation in Priano?" "Standard monitoring in place," Enzo said. "No unusual activity in the vicinity. Our presence remains invisible." A pause. "The woman from the neighboring villa, the American?" "Yes. She continues to be exactly what she appears." "She does," Nero said. Another of Enzo's judicious silences. "The Testa family's inquiries," he said, changing the subject with the tact of a man who understood that there were questions about his employer's personal life that were not his to ask. "Caruso has identified the source. It's not an expansion probe. It's something more targeted." Nero was immediately, completely attentive. "Targeted how?" "Targeted toward the coast, the Amalfi area specifically. Not your operations. You have no significant operations here. But the Testa family has interests in the luxury property market along this stretch. They've been acquiring through third parties." A pause. "It may be unrelated to you." "It may be," Nero said, in a tone that meant he did not believe this. "I'll have more detail by tomorrow." "Tonight," Nero said. He stood in his kitchen after the call, and the pleasant delirium of the evening before was gone, replaced by the specific clarity that arrived when he was reminded of what he was and what the world he inhabited required. He was not a man on holiday who had kissed a woman and was experiencing the agreeable confusion of early desire. He was the head of a family with structural enemies and complex obligations, and he was operating in a location that had just been identified as being of interest to one of those enemies. And there was a woman next door who was entirely civilian, entirely undefended, and who had now become not an asset, not a liability, not a variable, but a person. A person who had spent a month cracking his defenses open from the inside, not because she was trying to, but because she was simply herself. He set down his coffee. He had to tell her something. Not everything, but something that would allow her to make an informed decision. The choice he owed her, the minimum she deserved. He went to her door at 10, which was when he knew she was usually up and on her terrace. She came to the door in a white dress with paint on her left hand, her hair loose, and she looked at him with eyes that were careful and alert, reading his face the way she read everything. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood in her small, bright kitchen, with its bluefish coffee cup and its watercolor studies pinned to the wall. The sea, the cliffs, the boats, and one sketch of him that he saw and that stopped him for a moment. The drawing she'd told him about, and it was accurate was the first word, and then the second word arrived, and it was true, which was different, which meant she had drawn not his appearance, but something underneath it, something he rarely showed. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him at the small kitchen table and waited with the patient intelligence of someone who knew that what he was about to say required space. "Last night," he began. "Yes," she said. "Was real," he said. "I want to be clear about that first. What happened last night was not an accident or a mistake or something I want to distance myself from." She was watching him carefully. "But there is something I should have said sooner." He looked at his coffee, then at her. I am not an ordinary man. The things you've seen here, the men who come, the boat, the calls I take, they are not simply business in the ordinary sense of the word." A silence. "I know that," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not naive, Nero, and I'm not asking you to tell me specifics. I'm an adult who grew up in an American city, and I have working eyes. I've known for a while that you are what you are." She paused. "Which is a powerful man who operates in a world I know very little about, but which appears to be significant and not entirely above the conventional lines." He was very still. "But I'm also an adult who can make her own decisions," she said. "And I'm here for 7 more days, and last night was She stopped, looked at her hands. Last night was the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time. The honesty of it landed somewhere in the center of him with the weight of an absolute true thing. There is, he said carefully, a possible complication. Elsewhere in my world. Nothing that touches here directly, but I want you to know it exists, in the interest of accuracy. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up, came to where he was sitting, and did something simple and devastating. She put her hand on his face, the same gesture as the night before, and held it there. "Tell me when it's something I need to know," she said. "Until then, we have 7 days." He turned his face, slightly, into her hand. It was the most unguarded thing he had done in a decade. The 7 days were luminous. That was the only word for it. A kind of quality of light that applied not only to the landscape, but to the days themselves. The way time felt when you were in the middle of something that would not last, and you knew it, and you chose, deliberately, to be present anyway. She was present. She came with him to the cove in the early mornings, both of them in the water before the day was fully awake. The sea at that hour, pearl-colored and cool, and so clear that every stone on the bottom was visible from the surface. He swam beside her, unhurried, matching her pace with a consideration that she found almost architectural in its attention. He was always careful not to overwhelm her space, always maintaining the particular calibrated distance of someone who had decided to be gentle with a thing he was afraid of damaging. "You don't have to be so careful," she said one morning, treading water in the deeper part of the cove, squinting at him in the early light. He looked at her. "I'm not careful." "You are. You hold yourself back like you're worried about, I don't know, taking up too much room." Something moved through his expression. Old habit. What formed it? He was quiet for a moment, the water moving around them both. Then, "I learned very early that my presence, my full presence, could be too much. That people needed me to be," he searched for the right word, "edited." She thought about this. "I don't need you edited," she said. He looked at her in the early light, the water pale around him, and said nothing. But she felt the shift in the distance between them, the small contraction of the space he'd been maintaining. They swam back to shore together. He showed her parts of the coast she hadn't found. Not the famous parts, she had those already, but the small, specific, local things. A path that led to a swimming hole inland, fed by a spring, the water cold even in August. A baker in a village 4 kilometers up the road who made a savory pastry with escarole and olives that was neither listed nor advertised and that you had to know to ask for. A viewpoint above Praiano, accessible only by a steep, unmarked path, from which you could see the coast in both directions, and the islands, Capri and Ischia, as shapes on the horizon in the late afternoon haze. She drew all of it. She had moved past the sea studies now and was drawing the specific things, the baker's hands, the shadow of the wisteria on his terrace's limestone floor, the quality of light at the swimming hole, water green and dappled. She was drawing, she realized, the experience of this month, in the way you drew the thing you most wanted to keep. She was drawing him most of all, though she did not tell him this. The sketchbook that sat on her bedside table now had 12 pages of him, at the swimming hole with his hand trailing in the cold water, on the terrace with his coffee in the early morning, at Katerina's restaurant, looking at the menu, with that particular concentration he brought to even small choices. And once, her favorite, standing on the viewpoint path, looking at the sea with his back to her, the vista arrayed before him, the posture of a man who understood that what he surveyed was both his and not his. She was falling in love with him. She had been aware of this approaching fact for approximately 2 weeks, and had been, with some success, not looking directly at it. Now, on day 28, with 4 days remaining, she looked at it directly and found that it was simply true, unambiguously and without revision, in the way that the most difficult true things were simply and unambiguously true. She loved him. She was in the process of loving him. The past month had been whatever months were that reshape you. She did not tell him, not because she was hiding it, but because she was not certain what to do with it, and she needed to know that before she said it. There was the question of what came next. She was going home. That was the fact. She had a studio in Chicago, clients with ongoing work, a lease on an apartment, a life that was waiting for her in the ordinary way that lives waited. She had extended her rental by 5 days. She had called the agency on day 20 and paid the additional amount without thinking very hard about why, and she now had, counting from today, 4 days. He had not brought up what came after. She had not brought it up. They had established, without discussing it, a shared agreement to stay inside the present tense. But she was an adult. She was not going to fall in love with a man for a month and then disappear without something, without a conversation, without reality. She brought it up on day 29 in the most ordinary possible way. They were walking back from the viewpoint at dusk, the sky behind them going purple and gold, the lights of the coast below beginning to appear, and she said, "I leave on Tuesday." He said, "I know." She said, "And then?" He was quiet for several steps. The path was narrow here, and they were walking single file, and she could not see his face. Then, "I don't know how to answer that." "Try." He stopped. She stopped. They were on a flat section of the path with the sea visible through a gap in the cliffs, the last light on it. "My life," he said, carefully, "is not... I cannot promise you ordinary things. I cannot promise you access to all of me, because there are parts that would put you at risk simply by knowing them." He looked at her directly. "And you deserve ordinary things. You deserve something that doesn't require you to accept..." "Nero," she cut him off gently, "I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm asking what you want." He looked at her for a long moment. The light was very specific, that last Mediterranean light, golden and warm and already slightly elegiac, the light that knew it was ending. "You," he said, simply. "I want you." She held that, let it land. "Then we figure out the rest," she said. He was quiet. She could see the complexity moving through him, the wanting and the caution and the awareness of what his wanting her would cost, but also something else, something that pushed against all of it, that was simply and completely certain. He reached out and took her hand. The first time he'd done this in daylight, in the open, a gesture of claiming rather than protecting. They walked back to Priano hand in hand in the last light. On day 30, the Testa complication arrived. Nero was on a call when his phone lit up with Enzo's number, the specific pattern that indicated urgency, and he told Caruso to hold and switched lines. "We have a situation," Enzo said. "2 Testa men are in Priano. They arrived this morning, staying at the hotel above the main road." Nero was already standing. "Surveillance?" "Passive. They appear to be making inquiries about property, but the timing is..." Enzo did not need to say what the timing was. "Are they aware of my presence?" "Unknown. Possibly." Nero looked at the wall between his property and Fiora's. She was on her terrace. He could hear her. The faint sound of water being poured from a pitcher. The particular stillness of someone working. "Is she at any risk?" he asked, in English, briefly, and then immediately in Italian. "The woman next door." "Not currently. There's no indication they know about her or that she's of interest to anyone." Enzo paused. "But her presence creates a variable." "Yes," Nero said. He ended the call and stood in his kitchen and made the specific calculation that was the worst kind, the one that pitted what he wanted against what was right, and gave right no quarter at all. He went next door. She opened the door in her painting clothes, a loose shirt covered in color, her hair up, one eye slightly narrowed from concentration on whatever she'd been doing. She looked at him and read his face immediately. "Inside," she said, stepping back. He came in. He stood in her kitchen, the kitchen where he'd had coffee in the morning, twice now, where her work was pinned to the wall, where the blue fish coffee cup was always in the drying rack, and he said, "I need you to hear something." "Tell me." "There are people in Priano, not related to you, not looking for you, not interested in you, but they may be, monitoring my whereabouts, and your proximity to me may become..." He searched for the word. "A liability," she said. He looked at her. "I was going to say a variable." "Same thing." She was watching him with that direct, clear-eyed attention she always brought to the difficult things. No dramatics, no panic, just the specific quality of an intelligent person taking in difficult information and organizing it. What do you need me to do? Nothing. Continue as you would normally. I don't want you to change anything about your days. I have people who are watching the surrounding area, and you are not in any danger. But I want you to be aware. She was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me this because it's relevant to my safety, or because you want me to know what you are? He held the question. It was, like most of her questions, more accurate than comfortable. Both, he said. She nodded once, slowly. Then she went to her small kitchen shelf and picked up a jar of olive oil and set it on the counter, and stood with her back to him for a moment. He watched her. The line of her shoulders, the way her hands rested on the counter, the specific posture of someone processing something. I'm afraid, she said, very quietly. I know. She turned. Not of them, of this. She gestured at the space between them. Of having found... She stopped, started again. I'm afraid of how much I will miss this. Something broke open in him, quietly, without drama, just a clean break, like a thing that had been held too long under pressure. He crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps and put his hands on her face. Both hands, not the single finger touch she usually gave him. Both hands, framing her, and looked at her from very close distance. I'm afraid too, he said. I haven't been afraid of anything in a very long time. She searched his face. I want, he said, and found that the next words were not available to him in any language, that they required something he had not developed the machinery for because he had not needed it in years. She put her hand on his chest, over his heart, and held it there. I know, she said. It was the 3rd time she'd said this to him, each time meaning something slightly different, each time accurate in a way that bypassed his defenses entirely. He held her, in her small kitchen, with the afternoon light coming through the window and her paint-stained shirt against his chest, and thought with perfect clarity, this is not going to be simple. And I don't care. He dealt with the testamen with swift and total efficiency. They were, as Enzo had suspected, present in Priano not primarily because of Nero, but because of ongoing inquiries into coastal property. The timing was coincidental, or had become coincidental, since it was now clear they'd had no information about his holiday arrangements. 2 calls, 2 intermediaries, 1 very direct and entirely unthreatening message conveyed through channels that would not be misinterpreted. The Amalfi Coast was not an area that welcomed Testa expansion, and the relevant parties should find their property interests elsewhere on the peninsula. The Testa men checked out of their hotel on the following morning. Enzo reported this with the understated satisfaction of a man who enjoyed efficiency. Nero took note and returned his attention to the present, which was considerably more important. He had, he realized, approximately 3 days. 3 days to say all the things that months of careful management had prevented him from saying. 3 days to figure out whether the life he had built, elegant and sufficient and in every particular organized around the avoidance of exactly this kind of wanting, had enough given it to accommodate her. 3 days. He had, historically, been very good at knowing what his options were and choosing the best one. This was not that. This was not a strategic problem. This was simply the most important thing that had happened to him since he had stood in a Naples hospital 11 years ago and understood that his mother was not going to recover, and had felt, for the first time in his adult life, that the organization of his world was insufficient to address what he was actually experiencing. He went to her door. She opened it already in motion, already reaching for her bag. I was coming to you, she said. Where? Anywhere, she said. I have 3 days, and I want to spend all of them in motion. I don't want to sit still. He looked at her, at the energy in her, the urgency of the present moment animating everything. The boat is in the marina at Salerno, he said. We can take it tomorrow if you want. Her face opened completely. Yes, she said. Absolutely yes. The boat was 40 feet of white fiberglass and teak, sleek and fast, and he drove it with the ease of someone who had been on the water since childhood, which surprised her, since he'd told her the sea was something he'd looked at rather than lived in. You said you didn't learn to swim until 15, she said, standing at the bow with the wind pulling at her hair, the coast moving past in its parade of stacked pastel and white limestone. I didn't learn to swim until 15, he said, at the helm. I learned to drive a boat at 22. They're not the same skill. No, she said. Fair point. The coast from the sea was entirely different. The same cliffs, but seen from below rather than from beside or above, which changed their character. They were more vertical from here, more absolute. The drop from village to water more dramatic. The color of the sea in the boat's wake was a particular blue-green that she needed to add to her collection. He took her to Capri. Not the tourist Capri. Not the Piazzetta with its designer boutiques and watching crowd. Not the gondola to the Blue Grotto with its line of identical boats. He took her to the north side of the island, where the cliffs were steeper and the water darker, and the tourists didn't generally bother, and anchored in a cove that she would not have found without specific knowledge. The water here was so clear and so impossibly blue that getting into it felt like stepping into a painting. She swam for an hour. He swam beside her, and for the first time in their acquaintance, he was genuinely relaxed in the water. Not the pool-efficient strokes she saw in the mornings, but something more open, the body of a man not performing a function, but simply enjoying being in the sea. He floated on his back in the clear water, eyes closed, the sun on his face. She looked at him for a long moment. The Nero she'd learned, controlled, layered, always slightly at work on something, was entirely absent. This was what he'd been recovering, she realized, all these Julys. Not just rest. The permission to be this, unguarded, unheld. "What are you looking at?" he said, eyes still closed. "You," she said. He opened his eyes. She was treading water 2 feet away from him, looking at him directly. "I'm going to miss you," she said. Not a preamble, not a build-up, just the statement, offered cleanly. He stopped floating. He was vertical in the water now, looking at her with that full attention gaze, the depth of it. "I'll come to Chicago," he said. She looked at him. This was the first time either of them had said anything specific about the future. "Nero." "I will," he said. It was not performative or impulsive. It had the specific quality of a considered decision, the weight of something he'd been working toward. "I'll come in September, if you'll have me." "You have an organization to run." "I run it from wherever I need to run it from. I've been in 3 cities in the last month without stepping foot in Naples." He looked at her directly. "This is not logistics. I'm asking you something." She looked at the water, the clarity of it, all the way to the bottom. "You'll hate Chicago in September," she said. "It rains." "I'll bring a coat," he said. She laughed. He smiled, the real one, the one that changed his face. "Yes," she said. "Come to Chicago in September." They looked at each other in the impossibly blue water of a Capri cove, and the future, unformed, complicated, likely difficult in ways neither of them could predict, was present between them as a real thing, a thing they were choosing. She reached out and touched his face, her palm against his jaw, wet from the sea. He turned and kissed her palm. They ate on the boat at anchor, bread and local cheese, and the tomatoes that were still doing their summer miracle, and wine cold from the cooler, and the boat rocked gently in the protected cove, and the afternoon turned gold and then amber, and the coast of Capri glowed against the blue-black horizon. She was sitting across from him on the aft deck, her feet up, her sketchbook in her lap, drawing him. And he was watching her draw him, with the expression she'd discovered recently, the one that looked like being seen. "You still have that drawing," he said. "The first one. The one I wouldn't show you? Show me now." She considered. Then she set down her pen and went to her bag and found the sketchbook, a different one, the earlier one, and opened it to the right page and handed it to him. He looked at it for a long time. The drawing showed him in the pergola, profile and 3/4 view, the quality of shadow and light she'd worked for 2 hours to get right. It had captured, she knew, she was sufficiently objective about her own work to know, not just his appearance, but the specific quality of his stillness, the way his presence in a space had weight and intention. "This is how you see me," he said. "That's how you are," she said. He looked at it for another moment. Then, very carefully, he closed the sketchbook and handed it back. "Can I have it?" he said. "When you're done." "I'll make you a copy," she said. You can have the original. He looked at her with that expression she was going to carry with her, the complete and unmanaged one, the one that lived under all the others. You should know, he said, that you have changed something. I don't know yet what exactly, but something has changed. She held his gaze. I know, she said, for the fourth and final time. The boat rocked. The cove held them. The light finished its transformation from afternoon to evening, and they were still sitting across from each other with the remains of their meal between them, and the sketchbook in her hands, and the sea all around. 2 days left. She woke on day 31, knowing it with a specific bodily awareness, the way you knew important things, through the body first and the mind second. She lay in the white linen quiet of her rented room and listened to the sea, and did not reach for her phone, and did not begin organizing her return logistics, and simply was, for as long as she could manage it, simply present. Then she got up and made coffee on the mocha pot and went to the terrace. He was already in the pool. She stood with her coffee and watched him swim, which she had done every morning for a month, and thought, I will do this in Chicago in October. Wake up and drink coffee and reach for the specific quality of this blue water and his dark shape moving through it, and it will not be there. She thought about this without morbidity, without drama, simply as a fact. He saw her when he finished his laps. He stopped at the edge of the pool and looked up at her on her terrace above, both of them in the early light, and said nothing for a moment. Then, Good morning. Good morning, she said. They looked at each other for the length of a morning moment. Come down, he said. She came down. They had breakfast on his terrace. He made eggs with olive oil and the last of the escarole pastry from the village baker, and she drank a second coffee, and they sat together in the morning quiet, with the sea spread out before them in its early silver, and talked about nothing important. The name of the bird that sang in the lemon tree at dawn, whether the fishing boat that went out every morning at 5 was the same one or 2 different ones with the same coloring, what the weather would be for her last 2 days. She told him about her grandmother's garden in Salerno, the family story, the specific generation she'd never met, the woman who had apparently grown the best tomatoes in the neighborhood and who had told her granddaughter's mother just before she died that the secret was talking to them. My grandmother also talked to her plants, he said. Did it work? The plants were extraordinary. A pause. I don't know if she was talking to the plants or to herself. Maybe both, Fiora said. Maybe plants are a good audience because they don't answer back. He looked at her with that slight, almost smile. Some people prefer that in a conversation. You? She said. No, he said, and looked at her with complete directness. Not with you. She looked at the sea. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He waited. I'm in love with you. She said it simply, factually, in the tone she used when she was being accurate. I know that's complicated. I know the timing is whatever it is, but I wanted you to know it, because you told me something real, on the viewpoint path, and this is what I have to tell in return. The silence after was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of something that had been said and was settling, like dust after a stone has been set in its right place. He was looking at her. She looked back. I know, he said, and then, quietly, me too. She had known, had suspected, had read it in 100 moments, the way he looked at her, the way he'd organized his entire September around a city he'd never been to, the way he'd held her in her kitchen with his face against her hair. But hearing him say it, directly and without performance, me too, simple and complete, was different. She reached across the breakfast table and took his hand. They stayed at breakfast for 2 hours, which was not something either of them did under ordinary circumstances, and it was the best breakfast she had ever had in her life. That evening he took her to Ravello. Not for dinner. He had something else in mind. He drove the switchback road in the dark with the confidence of someone who had made this drive many times, and parked near the Villa Cimbrone and walked her through the garden in the moonlight to the Belvedere dell'Infinito, the Terrace of Infinity, where a railing of stone busts looked out over a cliff's edge to the sea below and the entire coast in both directions. She had been here in daylight. It was different at night. The lights of the coast were arrayed below in golden strings, the villages identifiable by their density of illumination, the sea between them dark and vast. The moon was 3/4 full, and its road on the water was very long. They stood at the terrace's edge, side by side, without speaking for a long time. "I've come here," he said eventually, "every year, sometimes alone, sometimes with others." A pause. "It's the kind of place that shows you the proportion of things." "What proportion?" He gestured at the spread of light below, the dark sea, the sky. "This was here before everything we've built. This will be here after." He glanced at her. "It makes the complicated things seem more proportional," she said. "Yes." She looked at the coast laid out below, the lights that were people in houses, eating dinner, sleeping, loving, arguing. The ordinary and extraordinary life of a coast that had been inhabited for 3,000 years and would be inhabited for 3,000 more. "Nero," she said. "Yes." "Whatever comes after this," she gestured at the view, at them, at July. "Whatever it is, I want you to know that this was not a holiday for me. This was not a parenthesis. Whatever happened here is part of my actual life." He turned and looked at her. The moonlight was on his face, and for a moment he looked entirely like himself, entirely exposed, the full weight and depth of him present, not defended. A man who had spent years making sure that nothing reached him past a certain point, standing in the moonlight having been reached, past every point. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, gently, as if she were something that required care. "Come back," he said, "at some point. Come back to Italy." "Or you come to Chicago," she said. "Or both," he said. "Both," she agreed. He kept his hand at her face for a moment, then slowly let it fall, and they stood together at the terrace of infinity, with the lights of the coast below, and the sea beyond that, and the moon above all of it. And she held his hand, and he held hers, and it was enough. She spent her last morning painting. Not the sea. She had the sea, in 17 sheets, as many expressions of it as she could capture in a month. She painted the view from her terrace, the particular angle that included, at the left edge, the corner of his lower terrace, the pergola and the wisteria and the edge of the pool, and in the middle distance his terrace railing against the water. She was careful and slow, and she put everything she knew about the light into it, everything she'd learned over 32 days of looking at this specific patch of Mediterranean geography. She finished it at noon. She sat back and looked at it. It was good. Better than good. It was, she thought, the best thing she had produced in 3 years, maybe longer. Not technically, necessarily, but in the way that mattered more. It was entirely present, entirely true, full of the actual quality of the thing rather than its surface features. You could feel, in the painting, the warmth of the stone and the particular smell of wisteria and the salt in the air, and the weight of the month that had happened inside this view. She had painted grief and joy and desire and presentness all at once, and it looked like a terrace in Priano. She texted Sasha a photo of it. Sasha, "Oh, Fiora, this is the most beautiful thing you've made in years. You're in love with him." "Don't answer that. I can see it in the painting." She did not answer that. She packed her bags in the afternoon, methodically, the way she packed when she was moving through a travel day with efficiency. Her clothes, her books, her professional equipment, the sketchbooks, all of them. The watercolors and the pens, the bluefish coffee cup, which she wrapped in a t-shirt and put in the middle of the bag. She was not, technically, supposed to take the cup, but the owner of the rental was in Rome and would never know, and she could replace it. She was keeping the cup. At 4 o'clock, she carried the painting down to his terrace. She had left it to dry in the sun, and it was dry now, and she wrapped it in the brown paper she'd found in the kitchen and knocked on his door. He answered immediately, which meant he'd been close to the door, which meant he'd been listening for her. She held out the package. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" "The view from my terrace," she said, "which also includes yours." He took it. He did not immediately open it, which she appreciated. The instinct to save it, to open it alone, told her something about how he related to things that mattered. "Thank you," he said. "I told you I'd give you the original," she said. He held the package. He was looking at her with the expression she had drawn 12 times in her sketchbook, the complete and unguarded one. "Come in," he said. She came in. He made her a coffee, not the quick morning coffee they'd shared on the terrace, but a proper afternoon coffee, unhurried, in the small white cups he used for espresso, with a piece of local chocolate he'd found somewhere. They sat at his kitchen island, as they had done many times, and talked, and there was no urgency in it. Or there was urgency, the quiet urgency of a last hour with someone, but it was not frantic, it was simply present. "September," she said. "I'll come the 20th, he said, "if that suits." "I'll be there," she said. "I'll always be there." He looked at her. "Tell me what your apartment looks like." She smiled. She described it. The 3rd floor of a Wicker Park building, red brick, a bay window that overlooked a maple tree that would be in full color in late September. A kitchen she'd painted deep green against all advice, which had turned out to be exactly right. The studio around the corner reached through an alley with its north-facing windows that gave the best light for color work. The coffee shop on the ground floor of her building, where she went at 7 every morning, which was nothing like this mocha pot and this terrace and this sea. "It sounds like you," he said. "It does, I think," she said. "This does too, here. But a different version of me." "The version that comes back to itself," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." They were quiet. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour, amber and particular, making everything gold, the kitchen, the white walls, him. "When I come to Chicago," he said, I'll be trying to be what I am in a different context." He paused. "I may not be immediately—" "You'll be exactly who you are," she said. "That's all I want." He looked at her with that expression, and she thought, he is afraid. A man who has run one of the most powerful criminal organizations in southern Italy for 9 years is afraid of a 2-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park, because the apartment is mine, and what happens in it matters. She found this so deeply moving that she had to look away. "I'm afraid too," she said, quietly. "I know," he said. They left together at 6, she to go back to her villa for her bags, he to walk with her up to the road where her car would take her to the ferry. The path they had walked every day, the stone steps, the lemon tree, the cat on the wall, all of it exactly the same as it had been on day 1, and entirely different. At the top of the path, before the road, he stopped. She turned. He looked at her, at the full, actual her she felt, every layer, everything the month had revealed. Then he stepped forward and kissed her, in the warm evening, at the top of the cliff path, with the sea somewhere below them and the stars beginning to appear above. With unhurried deliberateness, the kind of kiss that said, "This is real. I know what this is. I am not letting it be ordinary." When they stepped back, she was not entirely composed, which was fine. "September 20th, she said. "September 20th, he said. She picked up her bag. She walked to the car. She did not look back until she was at the curve in the road, and when she did, he was still standing at the top of the path, watching her go, in the gathering Italian evening. She turned forward. She drove. She arrived home in the rain. O'Hare in August, the specific fluorescent pallor of international arrivals, the smell of recycled air and duty-free perfume and hot asphalt from the taxi rank. All of it hit her with the cheerful amnesia of homecoming, the way her body stepped back into familiarity while her mind was still somewhere on a stone path above the Tyrrhenian Sea. She cried in the taxi, not dramatically, not for long, just the specific grief of crossing back over a threshold, of re-entering an old context while carrying new weight. Then she dried her face and paid the driver and went upstairs to her apartment. He called that night, which she had not expected. She had thought he would text. He was not, based on evidence, a phone person. But her phone rang at 10 Chicago time, which was 5 in the morning in Priano. "You should be asleep," she said. "I am asleep," he said. I'm calling in my sleep." She laughed. This surprised her. She hadn't thought she had laughter immediately available. "Are you home?" he said. "I'm home." She was standing at the bay window, the maple tree visible in the streetlight outside. "It's raining." "What does Chicago smell like?" She thought about it. Wet concrete. Something from a restaurant downstairs. Garlic, I think. The particular smell of a city in rain. She paused. Nothing like Priano. "No," he said. A pause. "Tell me what you see." She described the street, the maple tree, the lights in the windows of the building opposite, the taxi moving through the wet street below. She described it carefully, the way she described something she was going to draw, with attention to the specific and the light and the quality of the scene. He listened. When she was done, he said, "September 20th. "September 20th, she said. They stayed on the call for another 20 minutes, saying not very much, simply present on each other's line, the Atlantic between them and the time zones divergent, and none of it actually a barrier to the thing they were doing, which was simply being near each other in the only way currently available. The weeks between were not empty, which she had half feared, but differently weighted. She went back to her studio and picked up her ongoing work, and discovered, as she had hoped, that she had not lost her skills or her eye. But she had gained something, a quality of patience with the work, a willingness to stay with the difficult parts longer, to trust the process rather than rushing toward resolution. Her assistant Maya noted, with professional tact, that her recent work was different, richer. She painted. Not the client work, that was always digital now, but for herself. She painted the water studies, the ones she'd done in Priano, now on larger paper, in her studio with its north light. She painted the terrace. She painted him, not from the sketchbook, but from memory, and the memory was clear and precise, which told her how completely she'd looked. She texted him the images. He responded, always, with one or two words that managed to contain precisely what he meant. Beautiful, or the light. Once, of the painting of the terrace, I'm sitting there. She called him at midnight 3 times in the 6 weeks between August and September. He called her twice in the morning, his time, walking on a street in Naples that she could hear in the background, the particular music of that city, even through a phone speaker, even at this distance. He did not tell her about his work. She did not ask. This was the architecture they had agreed on, not ignorance, but elected boundary. She was not naive about his world. She had read enough, in those early days of curiosity after their first dinner, to know with relative specificity what she was in proximity to. She'd made her peace with it in the way that you made peace with complicated truths, not by pretending they were simple, but by knowing what mattered more. What mattered more was the man who had learned to swim at 15, and cooked his mother's pasta, and stood at the terrace of infinity in the moonlight, and told her, simply and without drama, "Me too." Sasha took her out for wine the week before he arrived. "I need you to understand something," Sasha said, with the directness of someone who loved you and was performing that love by being uncomfortable with you. "What you're describing, I know what I'm describing. You're describing a relationship with a man who—" "Sasha." Sasha looked at her. Fiora looked back. Something passed between them. The specific communication of 2 women who had known each other long enough that full sentences were sometimes redundant. "You've never looked like this before," Sasha said finally. "Even with Marco, when it was good. You've never looked—" "Like what?" "Like yourself," Sasha said. "Entirely yourself." Fiora looked at the wine in her glass. "I know," she said. "Then I have nothing else to say," Sasha said, "except be careful, and also invite me to the wedding." "There is no— the gala then. Whatever Italian Mafia bosses do for ceremonies. I want to be invited." "Goodbye, Sasha." "I'm serious about being invited." He landed in Chicago on September 20th at 11 in the morning, which she knew because he texted her from the gate. Arrived. "Your city smells like October." She was at her studio, which she'd been pretending to work in for 3 hours while actually achieving nothing of significance. She texted back, "Take the blue line to Western. I'll be at the coffee shop." She was there when he walked in. He looked The same was the first thing. The same contained quality, the same dark watchfulness, the same particular way of occupying a room as if he'd assessed it before he entered. But also slightly different, slightly less defended than he'd been in those first days in Priano, as if something had been permanently opened and remained open. He looked at her across the coffee shop. She looked at him. He crossed the room. She stood up. He put his hand on her face, both hands framing her, the gesture she'd first seen that night in her kitchen by the terrace, and looked at her very close, and then kissed her in the coffee shop in the Wicker Park morning, while the barista pretended not to notice, and 2 college students absolutely noticed, and she didn't care about any of it. "Hello," she said against his mouth. "Hello," he said. He moved through Chicago the way he moved through everything, with attention, with the particular quality of someone who was not just looking, but truly observing. She watched him watch her city, which was a specific pleasure she hadn't anticipated, seeing Chicago through his eyes, the grit of it, the industrial scale of it, the particular beauty of the lakefront in late September, with the maple trees doing their annual performance in reds and golds. "It's larger than I expected," he said, on their first walk along the lakefront. The lake so wide that the far shore was not visible, and it felt, in that light, like an inland sea. "People always expect a smaller American city," she said. "I expected it to feel chaotic, urban in a particular way." He looked at the water. "It's composed." "Chicago has a very specific pride in its architecture," she said. "People here actually care about buildings." He looked at her. "I noticed." A pause. "You live somewhere that's made with attention." She smiled. "I chose it on purpose." She took him through her neighborhood, showing him the things she loved about it. The independent bookshop that organized its shelves by mood rather than genre. The community garden behind the library, with its late-season sunflowers still tall. The record store that occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a stable in 1880 and still had the iron rings in the brick wall. He was a good person to show things to. He looked at everything she showed him and responded to it with genuine attention rather than social performance. She took him to her studio. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space for a long moment before coming in. The north windows, the work tables, the tacked-up color studies, the several large canvases that were the Priano paintings, which she'd been working on since she returned. He went to the paintings first. He stood before them for a long time. The sea studies, the cove, the terrace painting, his terrace, her terrace, the wisteria, the pool, the specific quality of July light. And then the last one, the largest, which was the viewpoint above Priano, the coast laid out in both directions, and in the foreground, slightly left of center, the figure of him. He looked at this one for a long time. "You paint the way you see," he said. "What do you mean?" "Completely, without simplifying." He turned and looked at her. "I've never been painted before. I didn't know what it would feel like to be seen that accurately." She looked at the painting, then at him. "How does it feel?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "True," he said. "Uncomfortable and true." She took him to dinner at a restaurant she loved. Not the fancy one, not the impression-making one, but a small Italian place in the neighborhood, run by a family from Calabria, where the pasta was handmade and the wine was simple, and the room was warm and slightly loud and smelled of garlic and bread and people having a good time. He ate with the appreciation of a man who knew food. "It's not compagnon," she said apologetically. "It's very good," he said, with complete sincerity. He looked at the room. "You're known here. I come every week. People looked at you when we came in. They know me." He was watching the room, and she could see the professional part of his mind noting it, the exits, the other patrons, the visibility from the street. A habit so ingrained it was involuntary, the perpetual situational awareness of a man who lived at a specific kind of risk. She reached across the table and touched his hand. He looked at her. "You're allowed to just eat dinner," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "Old habits," he said. "I know." She did not let go of his hand. "Try." He tried. She watched him do it, the deliberate loosening of the perpetual alertness, the choice to be, for this hour, in a restaurant in Chicago having dinner with a woman he loved, and not the thing he was the other hours. It cost him something. She saw that clearly. She also saw what it gave him. He stayed for 8 days. She showed him the things worth showing. The Art Institute, where he stood before a Seurat for 20 minutes without speaking, and before a small Caravaggio that had been acquired from a Neapolitan collection and which stopped him completely, a specific recognition on his face. I know this, not the painting, but the quality of the light, the darkness pressing at the edges, the specific theatrical illumination of a Campanian interior. The Caravaggio period in Naples, she said. I grew up 2 streets from where Caravaggio died, he said. A pause. Or allegedly died. The historical accounts are incomplete. She looked at him. You knew that when you said it. I did, he said. She laughed, and he looked at her with that expression, the complete one, the one she had been waiting to see again since August. She showed him Lake Michigan at dawn, which she drove him to one morning at 5:30, which he accepted without protest, in the way that people accepted the things offered by someone who knew a place better than they did. The lake in early morning light, vast and silver, the city behind them, and the water stretching to the horizon. He stood at the lakefront and looked at it in silence for a long time. I understand why you chose to live here, he said. Do you? The scale of it. He looked at the water. You need space, not absence, space, room for things to be large. She looked at the lake. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. He turned and looked at her. The dawn light was very specific, pale gold, long-shadowed, the particular quality of low autumn sun. He was, as she had noted many times in many different lights, very handsome. But that had become the least interesting thing about him over the course of 5 months of accumulated knowledge. What she saw, in the dawn by Lake Michigan, was a man who had been extraordinarily alone for a very long time, and who was, with great caution and great courage, trying to be less so. She took his hand. They walked along the lakefront as the city woke up around them. I need to ask you something, she said. Ask. What are we doing? She said it simply, without drama. I need, not a declaration, not a promise, just a direction. He walked for a few steps. Then, I want to come back, he said. Not once, regularly. And I want you to come to Italy. Not Priano, not only Priano. Naples, the life I actually live. She absorbed this. That's significant. I know what it means, he said, to bring you into that context. I've been thinking about it since July. He glanced at her. It's what I want. She thought about Naples, the city that made him, the Quartieri streets, the market with the fish that had been in the sea 6 hours before, the life he'd built from the specifics of where he was from. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, she said again. Yes, I want that. The actual life. He squeezed her hand once, briefly, and looked back at the lake. The city was fully awake by the time they walked back, and he walked through it with a slightly different quality. Not completely at ease, not the vacation openness of Priano, but something real and genuine and present. A man walking through the city of the woman he loved with the intention of learning it. She watched him and thought, there is so much still to learn. About him, about this, about what it means to love someone whose life is what his is. There are years of complexity ahead, and difficulty, and things that will require you to be exactly as honest and as brave as you have been for 32 days on a cliffside in July. She thought, I can do that. She came to Naples in November. He sent a car to the airport. Not, she noted, a flashy car, not the kind of performance that would announce him at arrivals. A dark sedan, a quiet driver named Rocco, who had the specific quality of someone who had worked for Nero for a long time and had seen many things and was constitutionally discreet. He carried her bags and drove her through Naples with the particular confidence of someone who knew every street and its character. She watched the city through the window. She had come to Italy before, Rome, Florence, the tourist circuit. But Naples was entirely different from those places, different from Priano even. It had a density to it, an intensity, buildings stacked and darkened by time, streets narrow and the light between them specific and particular, afternoon sun cutting through in narrow gold shafts. There was an energy here that was not the cheerful tourist energy of Positano or the cultivated elegance of Amalfi. It was something older and more compressed. She thought, he made sense in Priano, with the sea and the space. He makes sense here too, differently. This is where the weight of him comes from. He met her at the door of his apartment, the penthouse. She had expected something grand and architectural, which it was. A full floor of a building in the Chiaia neighborhood, with views of the sea to the south and the city spread before it. But what she had not expected was the specifically personal quality of it. It was not a showroom. It was a home that had been lived in alone for a long time. The books everywhere, the good art, the kitchen in which she could see actual use, the oil-stained marble, the mocha pot that was identical to the one in Priano. The table in the dining room had a jacket thrown over one chair and a stack of papers that were clearly not decorative. She loved it immediately. She loved it in the way she had loved his kitchen in Priano, the specific quality of how a person inhabited their own space, what they chose to have near them, how they organized the private context of their life. "Tell me about this," she said, standing in the living room, gesturing at a photograph on the wall. Black and white, Naples, clearly decades old, a street scene with children playing in front of a building she didn't recognize. "Quartieri Spagnoli," he said beside her. 1970-something. The building is gone now. That street doesn't look like that anymore. "Is that—" She leaned closer. A boy, perhaps 7, sitting on a step with his knees up. Something in the posture, the contained stillness of it. "My uncle found it," he said. "He thinks that might be my father. I'm not certain." She looked at the photograph for a long time, then at the room around her, the books, the art, the specific choices of a man who had grown up in a street that no longer looked like that, who had made from those origins something enormous and complex and deeply private. He was watching her look at his home. She turned, and he was leaning in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen with his arms crossed, not defensive, simply watching, the way he watched things that mattered. "I like it," she said. "Very much." Something in him loosened. "Good," he said. Then, "Are you hungry?" "Starving." He cooked. She sat at the kitchen island in the Naples apartment as she had in Priano and in Chicago, and watched him move through the kitchen that was his kitchen, in the city that was his city, and thought that this was what she had asked for, the actual life, not the holiday version. And it was, already, in the first hour, more real and more complicated and more completely itself than the version she'd imagined. He made pasta e fagioli. She understood what this meant, the specific choice of this recipe in this kitchen for her first meal here. "Your mother's," she said. "My mother's," he confirmed. They ate at the kitchen island instead of the dining table because that was simply where they were, and the city outside the windows was doing its evening transformation, the light going amber, the streets below filling with the post-work tide of people, a church bell somewhere, the particular quality of a Neapolitan evening. "Tell me something about Naples," she said, "that isn't in any guidebook." He considered. "The best coffee in the city is at a bar in the Quartieri that has no sign. It's been there since 1920. The owner's name is Salvatore, and he hasn't changed anything. Not the bar, not the price, not the recipe. He will not tell you how it's done, and he has refused, publicly and emphatically, several substantial offers to franchise or bottle it. He says the coffee belongs to the neighborhood." She smiled. "Take me." "Tomorrow morning," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen island. He was in his own context here. The contained alertness of him was present in a way it wasn't always in Priano, the full machinery of what he was running somewhere just behind his eyes. But also, underneath that, the person she had come to know in July, the man who ate pasta e fagioli on a terrace above the sea, and was, more than anything else, deeply alone and reaching toward not being. "Nero," she said. "Yes." "I'm glad I came." He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the specific quality of someone who was not going to be more emphatic than the truth required, "I know. So am I." He took her through Naples over the next 3 days with the same specific, unhurried attention he'd brought to her city, showing her the things that were not in the guidebooks, or were, but that no guidebook could fully explain. The Duomo, with its empale of San Gennaro's blood. The Cappella San Severo, where the veiled Christ lay in its impossible marble, which arrested her completely, which made her stand and simply look for 15 minutes in the specific silence of a person encountering a work that exceeds preparation. "How?" she said, finally. "Nobody knows," he said, which was not quite true. There were techniques, there were explanations, but was true enough for what she meant, which was, how does stone become this illusion of fabric and skin and breath? "I want to draw it," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll come back tomorrow." She came back and drew it, and the drawing was not adequate, which she expected, because some things exceeded the medium available for them, but it was the trying that mattered, the sitting with the impossible thing and attempting to understand it through the act of recording it. He had things to attend to during the days. He was, in Naples, more visibly what he was. There were meetings, she understood, and calls, and the presence of the organization in his life was more apparent here than it had been on holiday. She was not included in this. It was the agreed partition, the wall between what was his life and what was their life. She filled the time he was occupied by drawing Naples, the streets, the light, the specific quality of a city that was too ancient and too complicated for any single perspective to contain. She went to the market he'd told her about, the one with the very fresh fish, and stood in it for an hour drawing the fishmonger's stall, and the fishmonger's wife, who noticed her drawing and came over and looked at the sketch and said something in Neapolitan dialect that Fiora couldn't follow, and then went away and came back with a piece of fresh tuna cut from the day's catch, pressed into her hands, and would not accept payment. She brought the tuna home and told Nero, and he laughed, the real laugh, the one that changed his face. "She liked your drawing," he said. She didn't even look at the drawing. She looked. Neapolitans always look. They just don't let you see them looking. She understood, in that moment, something about him, something about where the quality came from, the attention that didn't announce itself, the observation that was total and not displayed. He had grown up in a city that watched, that saw without being seen, that read the world through a long habit of necessary attention. He was, she thought, the most thoroughly himself person she had ever known. On the last evening, she showed him the drawings she'd made of Naples. He went through them slowly, carefully, the way he'd looked at the Priano paintings in her studio. At the market drawing, the fish, the stall, the fishmonger's wife, he smiled. "You see people," he said. "I try." He looked at her across the drawings. "This is what you should do," he said. "More of this, not the client work." "The client work pays for the client work," she said. "You could show these." She looked at the Naples drawings, at the Priano paintings waiting back in Chicago, at the sketchbooks full of a month's worth of looking, the sea, the cliffs, the boats, the light, and a man on a terrace who had, without intending to, opened something in her that had been closed for years. "Maybe," she said. "Not maybe," he said. "You know what these are." She looked at him. He was right. She did know. She folded the knowledge away, for later, for the work she would do when she was home. On the flight back, she made 2 lists. One was practical, clients to complete, projects to close, the studio rent she needed to cover until she could afford to change the balance of her work. The other list had only one item on it. It said, Naples, Priano, the sea, him. Under it she wrote, "This is what I'm making now, January." She was in her studio at noon, which was her work hour, the light at its best for the new canvases, which were large and ambitious and required the kind of sustained attention that the morning was better for than the afternoon. She had been working since 8. Maya, her assistant, had gone for lunch. The studio was quiet, and the north light was doing exactly what good north light did, making the colors honest. She was painting Naples, not the postcard Naples, not the Duomo or Vesuvius or the famous chaos. She was painting the specific quality of light in a narrow Cortieri street at 4 in the afternoon, the gold shaft sunlight cutting through the gap between ancient buildings, and in it 3 women leaning from windows talking to each other across the air above the street. She had sketched this from observation and memory, and from the photographs she'd taken when she thought Nero wasn't looking. He was always looking. And now it was 8 weeks later, and she was rendering it large, at scale, with everything she'd learned about Mediterranean light applied to this northern studio in the gray Chicago winter. It was the best painting she'd ever made. She knew this the way you knew true things, not with ego or performance, but simply as an accurate assessment. The work had changed. She had changed. The month in Priano and the days in Naples and the winter visits that had become the rhythm of her year. He had been to Chicago twice more since September. She had been to Naples once and Priano for a week in October, which was the shoulder season and quiet, and the sea was a deeper blue and the light was sharper. All of this was in her now, and it came out in the work. She had sent photographs of the paintings to a gallery in Chicago she'd been vaguely aware of. Contemporary Italian-American painters, an interesting space in the West Loop, and they had, to her entirely genuine surprise, asked to meet her. The meeting had been 3 weeks ago. The show was scheduled for May. She called him when she got back from that meeting, and he had said, without pause, "I know." "You can't possibly know." "I know." "How?" "Because they'd have to be blind not to." She had sat down on her kitchen floor and laughed, which was what she did when she was very happy and off balance. He had come to Chicago for New Year's. That was the visit when something shifted for the final time. The last layer of maintenance, the last careful management of proximity. He had come with a bag that was slightly larger than the previous visits. She had noted this. She had not commented on it. On New Year's Day, waking in her apartment to the maple tree now bare outside the window and the city quiet under a thin layer of snow, he had said, "I would like a key." She had looked at him. He was entirely composed, which meant he was not entirely composed. "A key to what?" "To here." A pause. "I'm in Chicago more than I'm in Naples some months. Or I want to be." He looked at her directly. "If you're prepared for that." She thought about what it meant to have Nero Falcone, the person she understood him to be, not in spite of, but including all of it, with a key to her apartment in Wicker Park. She thought about the disruption and the complication and the ongoing negotiation with a reality that was not simple and did not apologize for itself. She thought about the terrace of infinity in moonlight, the pasta e fagioli in the Priano kitchen, swimming in the Capri Cove with the sun on his face, the first morning at the terrace wall, the bluefish coffee cup wrapped in a t-shirt. "Bottom drawer in the kitchen," she said. "There's a spare." He got up and found it, and she watched him from the bed, and he came back and turned it over in his hand, once, twice, and then closed his fingers around it. He arrived in January, on the 23rd, having called from the airport. She met him at the coffee shop, as was now their way. She was there with her coffee, and he came in from the cold, slightly dusted with the snow that had been falling, and she stood, and he came to her, and held her for a moment, in the particular way he held her when he'd been gone for more than a week, complete and unhurried. The barista, who had witnessed the entire arc of this relationship from the first September morning, set an espresso on the counter without being asked. "Thank you, Julio," Nero said. "Welcome back," said Julio. Spring came to Chicago in the way Chicago springs always came. Not gradually, but in a sudden reversal. A week of cold, and then one morning warmth, and the maple outside her window with the first green on it. She was standing at the bay window drinking her morning coffee when she heard him in the kitchen behind her, making his own, the mocha pot sound she knew. She did not turn around. She looked at the maple tree. He came and stood beside her, his coffee in hand, looking at the street. "Priano in June," he said. She looked at him. "I want you there from the beginning," he said. "Not the last month, from the beginning, the whole summer." She thought about her studio, her clients, the show in May that would change things if it went well. She thought about the logistical complexity of an entire summer in Italy. "I'd need to work," she said. "I can work from anywhere, but I need to work." "There's a studio," he said, "in the village. The woman who rents it goes to her daughters in Palermo in June." He had already looked into this. She looked at the maple tree. "The whole summer," she said. "Or as much of it as you can," he said. "Whatever you can give." She thought about the terrace and the sea and the mocha pot and the path to the cove and the specific quality of that July light that she had spent 6 months trying to put on canvas. She thought about Caterina's restaurant and the Greco di Tufo wine cold from the refrigerator and the lemon tree and the cat on the wall. She thought about him at the railing, looking at the sea, the first evening, his back to her. She had not known then. She had been a woman with a rolling suitcase on a stone path, jet-lagged and dazzled by light, taking in a stranger who stood against the sea with that quality of total stillness, and had turned, briefly, and looked at her with dark eyes that told her nothing and promised nothing. Everything had come from that, from looking, from the practice of paying attention. "You were standing at the railing," she said, out of nowhere. He looked at her. "That first evening, I came out on the terrace and you were at the railing looking out. I thought you were just a handsome Italian man with a very large house." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you think now?" She looked at him, this man who was complicated and private and dangerous in ways she understood more clearly now and had made her peace with more fully than she'd expected, and who cooked from his mother's recipes and swam every morning and had put a Giacometti on a table because he liked things made with intention, and who was standing in her Wicker Park apartment in the January light, holding a coffee cup and waiting for her answer with the complete attention he brought to everything she said. "I think you're still handsome," she said. He almost smiled. "And that the house is still very large," she said. The almost smile became the real one. "And that I want the whole summer," she said. He looked at her. Something in him settled, fully, finally, the way things settled when they found their correct position, the way a key turned in the right lock. "Then you'll have it," he said. She set down her coffee cup. She stood on her toes and kissed him, in the Wicker Park morning, with the maple tree going green outside the window, and the city coming awake around them, and the smell of coffee, and the specific quality of winter light, and everything that was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously. When she stepped back, he looked at her with that expression, the complete one, the one that lived under all the layers. She thought, "I will paint this too." She thought, "I will paint all of it." And then she stopped thinking, and simply was, in the present tense, with him, in the specific and irreplaceable moment of being loved by someone who had learned to do it slowly and completely and without reservation, and loving them back in exactly the same way. The maple tree held its first green. The spring came into the room like a promise. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary morning, unaware that something inside a bay-windowed Wicker Park apartment had quietly and permanently arranged itself, the way the most important things arranged themselves. Not in dramatic declaration, but in small, accumulated rightness, the way light accumulated until it was undeniably day. She went back to her studio that afternoon. She began the last painting. It was from memory, the first image she had stored, the one she had drawn quickly that first evening and then covered over. A man at a railing above the sea, his back to her, the water gold and rose behind him, the light making something of the ordinary moment. She did not add the woman on the upper terrace. The painting was his quality, his presence, the specific gravity of a person who occupied their world with full intention. It was the painting she had been trying to make since July, without knowing it. Not the sea, not the cliffs, not the light, but the thing that made the light matter, the witness. The one who stood at the edge of what was beautiful and did not look away. She worked until the light was gone from the studio. She worked until the painting was true. Then she put down her brush and called him, and he answered on the second ring, and she said, "It's finished." He said, "The Naples painting?" "The first one," she said, "the one from July." A silence. Then, quietly, "Can I see it?" "When you come," she said, "I want you to see it in person." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear Naples in the background, the city of him, the street sounds, the particular music of a southern Italian evening. "February," he said. "February," she said. They stayed on the phone until the city outside her studio went dark, and the streetlights came on, and the maple tree, which she could see from the studio window, was a dark shape against the navy sky, and his voice was the sound she'd been hearing for 7 months, and was now, she understood this completely, the sound she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. She would tell him this. Not tonight. Tonight was enough. Tonight was this voice in the dark studio, and February coming, and the painting finished, and the summer ahead of them, the whole summer, both of them together in Priano, with the sea spread out every morning in its miracle of color. Tonight was enough. Tonight was everything. Later, in the summer, the second summer, and then the third, she would try to identify the exact moment when it had stopped being a question. She would come back to the same answer every time. It was never a single moment. It was accumulated. It was the lemons on the wall, and the Caravaggio, and the New Year's morning, and the key in the kitchen drawer, and the mocha pot sound from the next room. It was 32 days in July, and everything that followed. It was a woman on a terrace, and a man at a railing, and the sea between them turned gold in the last light. It was the summer that had no last day after all.